1915. Fall asleep to Hilarious History. The Invisible Assassin and the Space-Time Shuffle by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Section 1. The Depth of the Abyss. Chapter 1. The Lusitania. The End of the Gentleman's War. By 1915, the human race had decided that the 19th century was far too polite, dusty, and prone to using words like fortnight and dashing. We had officially kicked the training wheels off the bicycle of progress and replaced them with caterpillar tracks, mustard gas cylinders, and a burning desire to see if we could turn the entire planet into a very expensive, very muddy parking lot. This was no longer a world of civilized disagreements settled over tea or a brisk duel at dawn. No, 1915 was the year we entered the global demolition derby, where the only thing cheaper than a .303 caliber bullet was the campaign promise of a politician safely tucked away in a bunker 300 miles from the nearest bayonet. You see, the Gentleman's War was a lovely little fiction we told ourselves to make the business of slaughtering one's neighbor feel like a high-stakes game of cricket. There were rules, or at least the suggestion of rules, much like the employees must wash hands sign in a saloon that serves rot-gut whiskey. You were supposed to announce your intentions, fly your colors, and if you were going to sink a merchant vessel, you were expected to give the crew enough time to scramble into lifeboats so they could watch their livelihood descend into the briny deep from a relatively safe distance. Then came the U-boat. A German U-boat is essentially a very cramped, very damp, and very smelly iron cigar filled with men who haven't seen a salad or a shower in 3 weeks. It is the ultimate social wallflower of the sea. It doesn't want to be seen, it doesn't want to talk, and it has a very pointed way of ending a conversation. The Floating Palace of Hubris. On May 1st, 1915, the RMS Lusitania departed from New York City. She was a marvel of the Cunard Line, a four-funneled testimony to the fact that humans really like to bring their furniture with them when they travel. The Lusitania was more than a ship. It was a floating ego trip. It had elevators, which in 1915 were essentially magic boxes that might or might not deliver you to your floor or the afterlife, electric lights, a nursery, and enough mahogany to panel the ego of a Roman emperor. The Germans, being a thorough people with a penchant for spoilers, actually took out advertisements in New York newspapers warning passengers that a zone of war existed around the British Isles. They essentially said, "Look, we've got these underwater tin cans and we're feeling a bit stabby. Maybe stay home and learn to knit." But the passengers were undeterred. After all, the Lusitania was the greyhound of the seas. She was too fast for a submarine, or so the logic went. It's the same logic people use when they think they can outrun a thunderstorm because they're wearing fast shoes. Besides, the British Admiralty had assured everyone that the Atlantic was perfectly safe, which is the kind of thing you say right before you lose your keys in the grass. The encounter at Old Head of Kinsale. Fast forward to May 7th. The Lusitania is off the coast of Ireland, specifically near the Old Head of Kinsale. The passengers are finishing lunch, likely discussing the price of wool or how remarkably stable the ship feels. Meanwhile, lurking beneath the waves, is Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger in the U-20. Now, Schwieger wasn't looking for the Lusitania specifically. He was just looking for something to justify the amount of diesel he'd burned. When the massive silhouette of the Lusitania appeared in his periscope, it must have looked like a giant, slow-moving birthday cake. He didn't check the manifest. He didn't send a polite telegram asking if anyone on board had a nut allergy. He simply gave the order to fire a single torpedo. The physics of a bad day. A torpedo is essentially a very angry metal fish that carries a grudge and several hundred pounds of high explosives. When it meets the hull of a luxury liner, the gentleman's war doesn't just end, it evaporates. The torpedo hit. Then a second, much larger explosion rocked the ship. To this day, people argue about what that second explosion was. The British said it was coal dust. The Germans said it was the massive stash of ammunition the ship was secretly carrying. Regardless of the cause, the result was that the unsinkable greyhound of the seas decided it wanted to become a permanent resident of the seabed in exactly 18 minutes. 18 minutes. You can barely get a decent sandwich in 18 minutes, yet that was all the time it took for 30,000 tons of British pride to turn into a vertical shipwreck. The Great Neutrality Life Jacket. The aftermath was a masterpiece of international outrage and very sternly worded letters. Over 1,100 people perished, including 128 Americans. Suddenly, the United States discovered that neutrality is a very poor life jacket. It's like standing in the middle of a bar fight with a sign that says, "I'm not involved," only to realize the guy with the broken bottle can't read. In Washington, Woodrow Wilson, a man who looked like he was perpetually smelling something slightly off, was in a bind. The American public was furious. They wanted blood, or at least a very public apology, and perhaps a free bratwurst. But Wilson was a man of peace, or at least a man of extreme hesitation. He famously said that a nation could be too proud to fight. This is a wonderful phrase. It's the kind of thing you say when you've been punched in the nose and you're trying to convince the crowd that you're actually winning by absorbing the other guy's knuckles with your face. The Germans, for their part, were defiant. They pointed to their newspaper ads and said, "We told you so." It's the international version of the "I'm not touching you" game played by siblings in the back of a station wagon, except with more corpses and fewer snacks. The fish get a decent meal. While the politicians argued and the British began the long process of turning the sinking into a recruitment poster, the only creatures getting a square deal were the fish. For centuries, the fish had to settle for the occasional drowned sailor or a crate of moldy hardtack. Now, they were suddenly gifted with a first-class buffet, a nursery full of toys, and enough brass fittings to decorate every reef from Kinsale to the Azores. The sinking of the Lusitania didn't bring America into the war immediately. That would take another 2 years and a very stupid telegram about Mexico. But it did something far more permanent. It killed the idea that war had boundaries. It proved that if you were on the water, you were a target. If you were a civilian, you were a statistic. And if you were a gentleman, you were probably at the bottom of the ocean, still clutching your teacup. The verdict of 1915. As the sun set on the wreckage of the Lusitania, the 20th century officially hit its stride. We had successfully combined the Industrial Revolution with the primal urge to hit things with sticks. We had built a world where a man in a tin tube could kill 1,000 people he'd never met, all before his morning coffee. Humanity had finally achieved its dream. We had made the world smaller, faster, and significantly more dangerous. We had invented a way to turn a luxury vacation into a tragic historical footnote in less time than it takes to watch a sunset. And as the survivors shivered on the Irish docks, they realized the terrifying truth of the new era. In the age of the machine, the only thing neutral was the gravity that pulled you down. So, sleep well. The Atlantic is deep, the U-boats are silent, and the politicians are still writing those letters. Just remember, if you see a periscope while you're eating your scones, it's probably too late to ask for the check. Chapter 2. The Fog of Death, the Debut of Poison Gas. By the spring of 1915, the Western Front had settled into a comfortable, albeit lethal routine of stagnant misery. It was the world's most violent HOA dispute. Both sides had dug a series of elaborate ditches that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, and they spent most of their time staring across a few hundred yards of mud at people who were doing exactly the same thing. It was a war of centimeters, where gaining 10 yards of territory cost 3,000 lives and a perfectly good weekend. The military geniuses in charge, men with impressive mustaches and offices conveniently located 30 miles behind the lines, were getting frustrated. They wanted movement. They wanted glory. They wanted a breakthrough, which is military speak for let's throw more men into the meat grinder and see if it jams. But the machine gun had made the old-fashioned bayonet charge about as effective as trying to stop a runaway locomotive by yelling, "Hush!" at it. Naturally, when humanity finds itself at a tactical dead end, it doesn't look for a peaceful exit. It looks for a better way to cheat. And in April 1915, at a little corner of Belgium called Ypres, the German army decided to stop playing by the rules of gravity and ballistics and started playing with the periodic table. The periodic table goes to war. Enter Fritz Haber, a chemist who was a genius in the same way a hurricane is a weather event. Impressive, but you really don't want him in your living room. Haber had figured out how to extract nitrogen from the air to make fertilizer, which saved billions of people from starving. Then, apparently feeling he hadn't quite balanced the scales of karma, he turned his attention to how to use chemistry to stop those same people from breathing. The Germans had a lot of chlorine. Chlorine is a wonderful chemical if you want to keep your swimming pool from becoming a swamp, but it's a bit of a party pooper when inhaled. It reacts with the moisture in your lungs to create hydrochloric acid. Essentially, it turns your own respiratory system into a DIY chemistry set that ends with you drowning on dry land. On April 22nd, the Germans lined up 5,730 cylinders of this yellow-green cocktail along their front lines. They weren't firing it from cannons. That would be too predictable. They were simply going to open the taps and let the wind do the dirty work. It was the first time in history that the weather report became a matter of national security. The ethics of the abyss. There were treaties against poisoned weapons, of course. The Hague Convention had explicitly forbidden the use of projectiles whose sole object was the diffusion of asphyxiating gases. The Germans, displaying a level of legal hair-splitting that would make a corporate lawyer weep with joy, argued that since they were releasing the gas from cylinders rather than firing it in shells, they weren't technically breaking the rules. It's like saying you didn't punch someone because you simply moved your fist forward and they happened to be standing in the way. The yellow-green ghost. At 5 p.m., the wind finally shifted toward the Allied lines. The German pioneers turned the valves, and a wall of greenish-yellow mist began to roll across no man's land. To the French and Algerian troops stationed in the path of the cloud, it looked like a strange, spectral fog. Some thought it was a smoke screen to hide an attack. Others probably thought the Belgian weather had finally decided to turn a festive color. They didn't realize that the air itself had just been weaponized. When the cloud reached the trenches, the gentleman's war took another giant leap into the incinerator. Men began to cough, then choke, then collapse. The soldiers who weren't immediately incapacitated did the only logical thing a human being does when the atmosphere tries to eat them. They ran. Within minutes, a 4-mile gap had opened in the Allied line. The road to Ypres was wide open. However, the Germans were so surprised that their science experiment actually worked that they didn't have enough reserves ready to exploit the hole. They were also a bit terrified of their own creation. It turns out that when you release a giant cloud of death, you're always one breeze away from a very awkward oops moment. The homegrown gas mask. The Allies were caught completely off guard. They had no gas masks. They didn't even have a word for what was happening. But human beings are remarkably resourceful when faced with the prospect of their lungs melting. A Canadian medical officer, likely drawing on the kind of practical wisdom one only gains from living in a place where the air is regularly trying to freeze you solid, realized that chlorine is neutralized by ammonia. And where do you find a ready supply of ammonia on a battlefield where supply lines are broken and death is literally in the air? You find it in your bladder. Soldiers were told to soak their handkerchiefs or socks in their own urine and tie them over their faces. Imagine, for a moment, being a soldier in 1915. You spent months in a hole in the ground, eating crackers that could break a tooth, surrounded by rats the size of house cats. And now, a British officer is telling you that your best hope for survival is to breathe through your own laundry. It was a primitive, disgusting, and utterly absurd solution. And yet, it worked. The urine-soaked sock remains one of the most effective, if least advertised, innovations in the history of defensive warfare. It allowed the Allies to hold the line just long enough for the wind to dissipate the gas and for reinforcements to arrive. The wind as a weapon of mass destruction. By the time the Second Battle of Ypres sputtered to a halt, the world had changed. The wind was no longer just something that ruined your hat or helped you fly a kite. It was a delivery system for agony. The introduction of gas was the ultimate admission that civilization was just a thin coat of varnish on a very angry ape. We had finally reached the point where we weren't just fighting an enemy, we were fighting the environment itself. The battlefield was no longer a place of courage or skill. It was a laboratory where the primary goal was to see how much suffering you could squeeze into a cubic meter of air. Naturally, the Allies didn't respond by saying, "Gosh, that gas stuff is terrible. Let's never do it again." No, they responded by hiring their own chemists and building their own cylinders. By the end of the year, everyone was spraying everyone else with a variety of flavors: chlorine, phosgene, and eventually the dreaded mustard gas, which smelled like horseradish and was about as pleasant as a sandpaper bath. The legacy of the fog. The gas didn't win the war. In fact, it barely moved the lines at all. All it did was add a new layer of terror to an already unbearable existence. It forced every soldier to carry a heavy rubberized bag around their neck, a constant reminder that at any second they might have to spend the next 4 hours breathing through a charcoal filter while their eyes burned. It turned the act of breathing, the most basic, involuntary function of life, into a death sentence. It was the moment the 20th century officially lost its soul. We had figured out how to kill people with the very air they needed to survive. As the greenish mist settled into the Belgian mud, the Iron Age gave way to the Chemical Age. We had proven that we could be just as creative at destroying life as we were at sustaining it. And as the soldiers sat in their trenches, clutching their urine-soaked rags and waiting for the next cloud, they realized that the Great War wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a race to see who could reach the bottom of the abyss first. And in 1915, we were making excellent time. Chapter 3. The Gallipoli Gamble. If the Western Front was a grim, unending stalemate, a place where men lived like moles and died like statistics, the Mediterranean theater was supposed to be the grand adventure. It was the brainchild of a young, ambitious, and remarkably certain man named Winston Churchill. At the time, Winston was the First Lord of the Admiralty, a title that sounds like it should involve a tricorn hat and a very expensive telescope. Winston was a man who possessed an intellect like a runaway locomotive, brilliant, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the fact that there were no tracks laid down for the destination he had in mind. Winston looked at the map of Europe, which, to a British aristocrat, is essentially a game board designed for the amusement of people with hyphenated last names, and decided that the best way to win the war in France was to leave France entirely. He turned his gaze toward the Dardanelles, a narrow strip of water in the Ottoman Empire that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. His logic was simple. We sail some old battleships up the strait, wave some flags, point some very large cannons at Constantinople, and the Turks will naturally realize that resisting the British Empire is about as fruitful as trying to argue with a thunderstorm. It was a plan of breathtaking elegance, provided you ignored everything about geography, logistics, and the fact that the people you were planning to invade might have a differing opinion on the matter. The geography of wishful thinking. The Dardanelles is a 30-mile stretch of water flanked by the Gallipoli Peninsula. To Winston and the planners in London, Gallipoli was a series of gentle slopes and pleasant beaches, the kind of place where one might enjoy a brisk walk and perhaps a picnic. They based much of their planning on outdated maps and the general assumption that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. The problem with calling someone a sick man is that even a sick man can still swing a very heavy club if you try to kick down his front door. The Turks weren't just sitting around drinking coffee and waiting to be conquered. They were led by a man named Mustafa Kemal, who would later be known as Ataturk. Kemal had a very clear understanding of the situation. If the British took the cliffs, the Ottoman Empire was finished. Therefore, the British would not be taking the cliffs. The first rule of naval invasions. If your plan requires the enemy to be surprised that you are attacking them with 100 ships and several thousand screaming soldiers, you might want to reconsider your plan. The naval phase began in February. The British and French sent a fleet of aging battleships, vessels that were essentially floating retirement homes for Victorian cannons, to blast the Turkish forts into rubble. It didn't go well. The Turks had these pesky inventions called mines, which are like underwater keep off the grass signs, except they explode. After losing several ships to mines and hidden shore batteries, the Navy decided that the water was too dangerous and told the Army, "Terribly sorry, old boys, but it looks like you'll have to walk from here." The landing, a study in chaos. On April 25, 1915, the Allied forces, composed of British, French, and the newly minted Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, prepared to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was supposed to be a surgical strike. Instead, it was a master class in how to turn a beach into a blender. The landings took place at several spots with names that sounded deceptively charming, like Cape Hells and Anzac Cove. However, the pleasant beaches turned out to be narrow strips of sand at the base of vertical cliffs that looked like they had been designed by someone who hated hikers. The British troops at V Beach landed in a converted collier called the SS River Clyde. They had cut holes in the side of the ship to allow the men to run out onto gangways. It was a great idea, right up until the moment the Turkish machine gunners realized that the holes were essentially exit-only signs for targets. The men who made it ashore found themselves pinned down on the sand. They couldn't go forward because of the cliffs, and they couldn't go back because the boats were being shredded. So they did what soldiers have done since the dawn of time. They dug. The vertical trench war. Within 48 hours, the Gallipoli campaign had achieved the one thing it was designed to avoid. It became a stalemate. But while the Western Front was a horizontal stalemate, Gallipoli was a vertical one. The Allies occupied the beaches and the lower slopes, while the Turks occupied the high ground. This meant that the Turks could essentially drop rocks on the British if they ran out of bullets. The trenches were so close together in some places that soldiers could hear each other snoring, or more likely, complaining about the quality of the tinned beef. The conditions were, in a word, biblical. It was roasting hot during the day and freezing at night. There was no fresh water, so everyone was perpetually thirsty. And then there were the flies. Imagine a swarm of flies so thick that you couldn't open a tin of jam without it becoming a crunchy, buzzing nightmare within seconds. The flies fed on the dead, then they fed on the living, and then they spread dysentery with the enthusiasm of a door-to-door salesman. The diet of champions. The primary staple for the Anzacs was bully beef and hardtack biscuits. Hardtack is a substance that is technically food, but possesses the structural integrity of a sidewalk. Soldiers would often carve the biscuits into souvenirs or use them as fuel for fires because eating them required a level of dental insurance that didn't exist in 1915. The water problem. Water had to be brought in by ship and carried up the cliffs in kerosene tins. If a shell hit the water carrier, it was considered a greater tragedy than if it hit the ammunition dump. You can't drink bullets, no matter how thirsty you are. The Anzac spirit and the great oops. For the Australians and New Zealanders, Gallipoli was their baptism by fire. They had come halfway around the world to fight for a mother country that most of them had never seen, and they found themselves stuck on a Turkish cliffside because a man in London liked the way the map looked. They quickly developed a reputation for being difficult, This is British military shorthand for men who don't see the point in saluting an officer who just told them to charge a machine gun with a butter knife. The Anzacs were irreverent, tough, and possessed a dark sense of humor that was perfectly suited for a campaign that was increasingly looking like a suicide pact. The tragedy of Gallipoli was that the men on the ground were incredibly brave, but they were being directed by men on ships who were operating on vibe rather than intel. There was a famous incident where a massive British reinforcement landing at Suvla Bay was delayed because the commanding general decided that the most important thing to do upon hitting the beach was to have a nice cup of tea and wait for his luggage. While he was waiting for his favorite teapot, the Turks moved in and took the surrounding hills. The gamble had officially gone bust. The great vanishing act. By December, even the mustaches in London had to admit that Gallipoli was a disaster. The decision was made to evacuate. Ironically, the evacuation was the most successful part of the entire campaign. It was the only time the Allies managed to outsmart the Turks. They used ghost soldiers, rigging rifles with dripping water tins so they would fire at intervals, making the Turks think the trenches were still occupied. They muffled the oars of the boats and slipped away in the middle of the night. When the Turks finally charged the Allied lines the next morning, they found nothing but empty tins of bully beef and a few sarcastic notes left behind by the Australians. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties to gain exactly 0 inches of territory. Winston Churchill was forced to resign from the Admiralty and spent the next few months in the trenches of France, presumably reflecting on the fact that maps and reality are often not on speaking terms. The verdict of the cliffs. Gallipoli proved that the 20th century was not a place for grand adventures. It was a place where old-world arrogance met new-world technology and lost. It was a reminder that the world is a lot bigger, steeper, and more stubborn than it looks from a mahogany desk in London. The Turks had defended their homeland with a ferocity that stunned the invaders. The Anzacs had forged a national identity out of shrapnel and sand, and the British Empire had learned that even the most elegant plan is no match for a man with a rifle and the high ground. As the last boat pulled away from Anzac Cove, the ghosts of Gallipoli remained, 250,000 of them. The sick man of Europe had proven to be quite healthy, and the gentleman's war had found yet another way to turn a beach vacation into a mass grave. Chapter 4. The Anzac Spirit. If you were to take a look at the world map in 1915, you'd notice that Australia and New Zealand are situated quite comfortably at the bottom of everything, as if the planet had decided to store its most interesting wildlife and most resilient people in a spare drawer near the Antarctic. For decades, these two nations were seen by the rest of the world, and particularly by the mother country in London, as little more than giant sheep paddocks with a side order of gold mines and surf. They were colonies. They were the boys. They were the loyal offspring who were expected to send wool, wheat, and the occasional rugby player back to England whenever the king felt a bit peckish or lonely. But then came the Great War, and the boys were called up to the big league. The resulting acronym ANZAC sounds like the name of a high-powered industrial degreaser or perhaps a brand of particularly crunchy crackers. In reality, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps was a collection of volunteers who possessed a level of irreverence that made the British High Command break out in hives. These were men who had spent their lives wrestling crocodiles, shearing sheep at breakneck speeds, and surviving droughts that would make a cactus quit. They were not professional soldiers in the sense that they didn't particularly care for the decorative aspects of military life. To an Anzac, a salute was a confusing gesture you performed when you couldn't find a polite way to tell an officer his hat looked ridiculous. The Great Misunderstanding. The Anzacs arrived in Egypt for training, and the British officers were immediately horrified. The Australians, in particular, viewed military discipline as a set of helpful suggestions rather than actual rules. They didn't see why they should march in straight lines when the destination was going to be there, regardless of how they walked. They didn't see why they should call a 19-year-old lieutenant "Sir," just because he'd attended a fancy school and possessed a mustache that looked like a tired caterpillar. They were diggers. The term originated because they spent a significant portion of their existence in Turkey digging holes. But it also perfectly encapsulated their philosophy. If there's a job to do, get into the dirt and do it. But don't expect me to polish my boots afterward. When they finally landed at Gallipoli, at a spot that would forever be known as Anzac Cove, they discovered that the British planners had accidentally dropped them at the bottom of a cliff that was roughly the steepness of a skyscraper. It was the ultimate oops in a year already overflowing with them. But instead of turning around and going home, the Anzacs looked at the vertical wall of Turkish snipers and decided, well, I suppose we'd better climb it then. The humor of the damned. What set the Anzac spirit apart wasn't just their bravery. Everyone was being brave in 1915, mostly because the alternative was being shot by their own side. It was their refusal to take the catastrophe seriously. They produced a magazine in the trenches called the Anzac Book. It was filled with poems, cartoons, and satirical advertisements that mocked their own misery. They ran classified ads for things like second-hand halos, slightly dented, or trench for rent, excellent view of the enemy, owner leaving for the hospital. They found a way to laugh at the fact that they were eating tinned meat that was 40% gristle and 60% mystery, while being bothered by flies that were bold enough to try and steal the cigarettes right out of their mouths. This was the digger ethos, a profound, bone-deep skepticism of authority combined with an unbreakable loyalty to the man standing next to you in the mud. They called it mateship. It's a word that sounds cuddly, but in 1915, it was the only thing that kept the front line from dissolving into a puddle of despair. Mateship meant that if your friend was stuck in no man's land, you went out and got him, not because it was the honorable thing to do, but because he owed you 5 shillings and you weren't about to let him die before he paid up. The invention of the drip rifle. One of the greatest examples of the Anzac spirit was the invention of the drip rifle. During the evacuation of Gallipoli, which, as we've discussed, was the only part of the campaign that didn't involve someone in London throwing a dart at a map, the Allies needed to sneak away without the Turks noticing. If the Turks realized the trenches were empty, they'd swarm down the hills and turn the evacuation into a massacre. Enter William Scurry, an Australian sergeant with a knack for tinkering. He rigged up a system involving 2 kerosene tins. The top tin was filled with water, which would slowly drip into the bottom tin. When the bottom tin got heavy enough, it would pull a string attached to the trigger of a rifle. The result was a ghost army. All through the night, as the last of the Anzacs were rowing away to the safety of the ships, rifles would sporadically fire from the empty trenches. Drip, drip, bang! To the Turks, it looked like the Australians were still there, presumably having a midnight snack and a grumble. By the time the Turks realized they were shooting at empty tin cans, the Anzacs were miles away, probably already arguing about whose turn it was to make the tea. It was the ultimate Australian victory, winning by being cleverer, lazier, and more deceptive than the enemy ever thought possible. The birth of a national identity. Before 1915, Australia and New Zealand were just places. After 1915, they were nations. It is one of the great ironies of history that these two countries found their souls in a pile of shrapnel on a Turkish cliffside. They realized they weren't just British people who lived in the sun. They were something else entirely. They were people who could endure the impossible, mock the powerful, and survive the incompetence of their superiors with a wink and a shrug. They had brought their own hats, the iconic slouch hat, with one side pinned up so they could sling a rifle without knocking their headgear off. That hat became a symbol of a different kind of soldier, one who didn't care for the parade ground but was the first one into the breach. The Anzac legend grew to be so large that it eventually threatened to overshadow the actual horrific reality of the war. But at its core, it was a testimony to the human spirit's ability to find a sense of self in the middle of a senseless slaughter. They had gone into the war as children of the empire and come out as the unruly, independent adults who would eventually go on to invent things like the shoey and some of the world's most creative swear words. The verdict on the diggers. As 1915 rolled on, the Anzacs were moved from the cliffs of Gallipoli to the mud of the Western Front. They brought their slouch hats, their sarcasm, and their drip rifle ingenuity with them. They became known as the shock troops of the empire, the men you sent in when the situation was so dire that only someone with a complete disregard for their own safety and a pathological hatred of paperwork could fix it. They proved that you don't need 1,000 years of history to have a culture. Sometimes all you need is 6 months in a trench, a few million flies, and a mate who's willing to share his last dry biscuit. The tragedy of the Anzacs is that so many of them never made it back to the sun-drenched paddocks they had left. But the spirit they forged, the idea that you stand by your friends, you mock the bullies, and you never, ever take a politician's map at face value, remains the most enduring legacy of the year the world went mad. Section 2. Science bends the rules. Chapter 5. Einstein's General Relativity, the Universe as a Sagging Mattress. While the rest of the world was busy perfecting the art of turning its young men into fertilizer in the mud of Flanders or on the jagged cliffs of Turkey, a man in Berlin was quietly busy committing the greatest act of intellectual arson in human history. His name was Albert Einstein, and in 1915 he decided that the universe, the whole grand, glittering, infinite mess of it, needed a complete remodel. Now, humanity has a peculiar habit of assuming we've got the world figured out every few centuries. We find a comfortable set of rules, we tuck them under our pillows, and we sleep soundly, convinced that the stars know their place. For over 200 years, that comfort was provided by Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac was a brilliant man, though by most accounts he was about as much fun at a dinner party as a wet wool blanket. He told us that gravity was a pull. He suggested that every object in the universe was connected by invisible, ghostly tethers. The earth pulled on the moon like a worried mother clutching a toddler's hand, and the sun pulled on the earth to keep it from wandering off into the dark. It was a tidy clockwork universe. Space was a fixed stage where things happened, and time was a steady, reliable metronome that ticked away the same for a king as it did for a turnip. It was a comforting lie, and we loved it. But in 1915, Einstein walked onto that stage, threw a lit match into the curtains, and told us the stage was actually made of Jell-O. The patent clerk's revenge. Einstein didn't look like a man who was about to murder the laws of physics. By 1915, he had moved on from his days as a patent clerk, but he still possessed that general air of a man who had been startled by a toaster and never quite recovered. He had the hair of a man who had declared war on combs and lost. But behind that chaotic frizz was a mind that could look at a beam of light and see a cosmic speed limit, or look at a falling elevator and see the secrets of the gods. Einstein realized that Newton's invisible tethers were a bit of a dodge. How did the sun pull on the earth across 93 million miles of absolutely nothing? It didn't make sense. It was like saying you could pull a wagon with a string made of hope and good intentions. Einstein's invisible assassin wasn't a force at all. It was geometry. The cosmic trampoline. To understand general relativity, you have to stop thinking of space as nothing and start thinking of it as something. Einstein suggested that space and time are woven together into a four-dimensional fabric called space-time. Think of it as a giant, infinite cosmic trampoline made of very high-quality spandex. Now, if you place a bowling ball in the center of that trampoline, what happens? It makes a dent, a big, sagging, glorious curve in the fabric. If you then take a few marbles and roll them across the trampoline, they don't move in straight lines. They roll into the curve. They circle the bowling ball, not because the ball is pulling them with a secret string, but because the very floor they are standing on is slanted. This, Einstein said, is gravity. The sun is a heavy bowling ball that has made a massive dent in the universe, and the earth is just a marble trying its best to roll in a straight line while the fabric of the cosmos is yelling, "Left! Turn left!" It was a revolutionary idea. It turned gravity from a mysterious tug-of-war into a cosmic game of billiards played on a sagging mattress. The space-time shuffle. But Einstein wasn't done. He decided that if space was flexible, then time had to be its dance partner. In the space-time shuffle, the faster you move, or the closer you are to a heavy object, a deep dent, the slower time moves for you. This is where the hilarious history part comes in, because it means that your head is technically older than your feet. Since your feet are closer to the center of the earth, and thus deeper in the dent, time moves a fraction of a second slower for them than it does for your ears. It's a brilliant theory that explains why a clock on a mountain ticks faster than a clock in a valley. But it does absolutely nothing to explain why. Despite the universe being a flexible fabric of infinite possibilities, you still can't find your car keys in the morning. Imagine being able to calculate the curvature of light around a distant star, but still being defeated by a pair of socks that have decided to enter a parallel dimension behind the dryer. That is the human condition in a nutshell. We are geniuses who can weigh the stars, yet we are regularly outsmarted by our own pockets. The invisible assassin strikes. Einstein's theory was the invisible assassin because it quietly murdered the idea of an absolute reality. It told us that there is no now that applies to everyone. Your now and a Martian's now and a star's now are all different, depending on how fast you're going and how much lunch you've had, or rather, how much mass you're carrying. The scientific community in 1915 reacted to this with a mixture of awe and the kind of headache you get from trying to fold a fitted sheet. They asked for proof. Einstein, with the confidence of a man who knows he's the only one in the room who actually did the homework, said, "Wait for an eclipse." He predicted that during a solar eclipse we would be able to see starlight bending as it passed near the sun, proving that the sun had indeed dented the fabric of the universe. When the proof eventually came a few years later, Einstein became the first global science superstar. He was the man who had looked at the universe and found it was a bit of a funhouse mirror. Why it matters, besides the headache. You might ask, why does this matter to me? I'm just trying to get through 1915 without being hit by a U-boat or a cloud of chlorine gas. Well, general relativity is the reason your GPS works today. If the engineers didn't account for the fact that time moves differently for the satellites in orbit than it does for your phone on the ground, your GPS would be off by several miles within a single day. You'd be looking for a Starbucks and end up in the middle of a lake. Einstein saved us from being perpetually lost, even if he couldn't help us find those keys. But more importantly, Einstein's masterpiece reminded us that the universe is far more imaginative than we are. While we were busy using our limited technology to destroy each other's cities, Einstein was using nothing but a pencil and a very large brain to show us that the stars themselves are dancing on a trampoline of our own making. He showed us that the invisible assassin of gravity isn't a hunter. It's just the shape of the road. And as we roll toward the heavy spots in the fabric of the universe, we should probably stop to appreciate the view. After all, space-time is a sagging mattress, and we're all just marbles rolling toward the inevitable. We might as well enjoy the ride, even if the destination is a bit of a dent. The verdict of the stars. By the end of 1915, Einstein had finished his papers. He had reshaped the infinite. He had proved that space is curved, time is relative, and gravity is a geometric hiccup. He had provided a brilliant, elegant solution to the mysteries of the heavens. And then he likely went home, realized he'd forgotten to buy milk, and spent 20 minutes looking for his glasses while they were perched on top of his head. Because that is the true general relativity. The more you understand the vastness of the cosmos, the more ridiculous the small things become. We are a species that can comprehend the space-time shuffle. Yet we are still baffled by the mystery of why the toast always lands butter side down. Perhaps the toast is just following the curvature of the mattress. Chapter 6. The Transcontinental Hello. The 3,400-mile shout. By January 1915, the world had spent several months proving that it was exceptionally good at using technology to stop people from breathing. It was high time, then, that someone used technology to help people talk, specifically to help people talk to someone so far away that they couldn't possibly throw a shoe at you when the conversation took a turn for the boring. On January 25th, Alexander Graham Bell sat in a plush office in New York City. He was now an elderly gentleman with a white beard that looked like it was woven from the very clouds of Olympus. Across the country, in San Francisco, sat his old partner in crime, Thomas Watson. Between them lay 3,400 miles of rugged American terrain, several mountain ranges, countless deserts, and precisely 130,000 telephone poles, each one acting as a very tall, very thin monument to human persistence, and a prime piece of real estate for the nation's woodpeckers. This was the inauguration of the first transcontinental telephone line. It was the moment the United States finally realized that the best way to keep the West Coast from drifting off into the Pacific was to tether it to the East Coast with 2,500 tons of copper wire. The bromance of the century. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to go back to 1876, when Bell and Watson first made history in a cramped Boston boarding house. Back then, Bell had accidentally spilled acid on his trousers, an occupational hazard for 19th century inventors, and shouted the immortal line, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Watson had heard him through the wire, and the telephone was born. It was the ultimate butt dial of the Victorian era. Fast forward 39 years to 1915, and the duo decided to recreate the magic for the benefit of the press and the history books. Bell, speaking into a replica of the original wooden telephone, repeated his famous request, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Watson, sitting 3 time zones away and likely enjoying the fact that there was no acid involved this time, replied with the first truly great long-distance quip, "It would take me a week now." It was a perfect moment of technological triumph, mixed with a healthy dose of reality. We had conquered space, but we still hadn't quite figured out how to make a train move faster than a briskly trotting horse. 130,000 poles and a lot of hope. Building this line was a feat of engineering that bordered on the deranged. It wasn't just a matter of stringing a wire from a tree in Jersey to a fence post in California. In 1915, electricity had a nasty habit of getting tired. If you just sent a voice signal down a 3,400-mile wire, by the time it reached the Midwest, it would sound like a ghost whispering in a blizzard, and by Nevada, it would be nothing but silence. The engineers had to invent loading coils, little iron rings that acted like caffeine shots for the electrical signal to keep the voice moving. They also had to deal with the fact that the American wilderness was generally hostile to the concept of customer service. Linesmen had to haul poles through snowdrifts, over rocky crags, and across scorching salt flats. They were essentially building a nervous system for a continent that didn't know it wanted one. And they did it all without GPS, without power tools, and without the ability to call for help if they got stuck. Because, well, the phone line wasn't finished yet. The copper connection. The project used over 6 million pounds of copper. In a year where copper was being rapidly converted into shell casings to be fired at trenches in Europe, spending it on a conversation was a radical act of optimism. It was a choice to value hello over kaboom. The "I can hear you now" dance. The 1915 transcontinental call introduced the world to a new social ritual, the long-distance verification dance. Today, we take for granted that we can talk to a cousin in Tokyo while sitting in a bathtub in Ohio. But in 1915, the idea that a human voice could travel 3,400 miles in a fraction of a second was terrifyingly close to witchcraft. The first several minutes of any long-distance call were inevitably consumed by both parties shouting, "Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me now?" We haven't changed much in a century. We've gone from 130,000 wooden poles to billions of transistors and satellites. And the first thing we still say when we pick up a phone is a desperate plea for confirmation that we aren't shouting into the void. The call also solidified the word hello as the official greeting of the telephone. Thomas Edison had championed hello, while Bell, a man of more nautical tastes, had spent years trying to make ahoy hoy the standard. Imagine a world where every time your boss called you, you had to respond like a 17th century pirate. We were one linguistic coin flip away from a much more interesting, albeit much more maritime, corporate culture. The Panama Pacific International Exposition. The call was synchronized with the opening of the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. This was a World's Fair designed to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal, but more importantly, to show the world that San Francisco had recovered from the 1906 earthquake. The city had been a pile of smoldering rubble only 9 years prior, and now it was hosting a transcontinental chat with the President of the United States. It was a classic San Francisco move. We might be on a fault line, but at least we can hear what people in New York think of the weather. Woodrow Wilson joined the call from the White House because a politician will never miss an opportunity to take credit for a miracle they didn't personally perform. He congratulated Bell and Watson, probably unaware that he was witnessing the birth of the 24-hour news cycle and the eventual invention of the strongly worded tweet. The luxury of noise. In 1915, a 3-minute call from New York to San Francisco cost about $20.70. In modern currency, that's roughly $600. At that price, you didn't call someone just to ask what they had for lunch or to complain about the neighbors. You called because someone was getting married, someone was dying, or you had discovered a way to turn lead into gold. Every word had a price tag. It made people concise. It made them purposeful. It was an era of linguistic efficiency that was destined to be completely destroyed the moment the prices dropped. The telephone was also transforming the social fabric of the country. Before the phone, if you wanted to talk to someone, you had to see them or write them a letter and wait 3 days for the ink to dry. Now, you could be in 2 places at once. You could be in your parlor in Boston and in your mother's kitchen in Chicago simultaneously. It was the first step toward the invisible presence that defines our modern lives. The feeling that no matter where you are, your phone is a tiny tether back to everyone you've ever met. The verdict of the wire. The transcontinental hello of 1915 was more than just a clever trick. It was the official end of distance as a meaningful concept in America. The frontier was no longer a vast, silent expanse. It was a wired grid. While the invisible assassin of gravity was bending light in Einstein's mind, the invisible thread of copper was bending the map of the United States. We were becoming a smaller nation, a noisier nation, and a nation that was increasingly obsessed with the sound of its own voice. As Bell hung up the phone in New York, he must have felt a sense of completion. He had started with a spilled glass of acid and ended with a continent-spanning web of conversation. He had given us the ability to reach out and touch someone's ear from 3,000 miles away. Of course, he also gave us the ability to be reached by telemarketers, bill collectors, and that one uncle who won't stop talking about his gout. But that's the price of progress. In 1915, the hello was a miracle. Today, it's a notification. But as you fall asleep, just imagine those 130,000 poles standing silent in the moonlight, humming with the ghosts of a million ahoy-hoys that never were. Chapter 7. The Pluto Prediscovery, the Celestial Whoops. While Einstein was busy bending the very fabric of reality, and Alexander Graham Bell was trying to convince the world that shouting into a box was the future of civilization, a man in Flagstaff, Arizona, was engaged in the ultimate cosmic game of Where's Waldo? His name was Percival Lowell, and in 1915 he managed to achieve something truly remarkable. He successfully discovered a planet without having the slightest clue that he had done so. Human beings have a peculiar talent for looking directly at a miracle and complaining about the lighting. We are a species that can stare at the most profound secrets of the universe and think, is that a smudge in my lens or a new frontier of existence? Percival Lowell was a man who lived in that smudge. He was a wealthy Bostonian with a magnificent mustache, a formidable intellect, and a level of stubbornness that would have made a mountain goat look like a pushover. Lowell was the Ahab of the Arizona Plateau. He had built his own observatory because he didn't want to wait in line for someone else's telescope, and he spent his nights searching for Planet X. He was convinced that there was a giant, mysterious world lurking in the outer reaches of our solar system, tugging on the orbits of Uranus and Neptune like a mischievous child pulling on a tablecloth. The Martian Canal Man. To understand why Lowell was so obsessed with Planet X, you have to understand his history with Mars. A few years earlier, Lowell had convinced himself, and a surprising number of people who should have known better, that Mars was crisscrossed by a network of canals. He believed these canals were built by a desperate, aging civilization to transport water from the polar ice caps to their thirsty cities. He didn't just see canals, he drew them. He mapped them. He wrote books about them. It was a beautiful, romantic, and utterly insane vision of a dying world. The problem was that the canals were actually just optical illusions created by the limitations of his telescope and the fact that the human brain is hardwired to see patterns in the dust. Lowell wasn't looking at Martian engineering. He was essentially looking at the face on Mars before it was cool. So, by 1915, Lowell's reputation was a bit like a Victorian chimney, impressive to look at, but filled with a lot of soot. He needed a win. He needed Planet X to prove he wasn't just a man who saw ghosts in the stars. The Plates of Destiny. In March and April of 1915, the Lowell Observatory turned its gaze toward the constellation of Gemini. They were taking photographic plates, massive slabs of glass coated in light-sensitive chemicals. In the age before digital sensors and night mode on your phone, astronomy was a slow, shivering business. You sat in a dome that was kept at the same temperature as the outside air, which in Flagstaff in March is liquid nitrogen adjacent, and you waited for the light of distant worlds to burn their image into the glass. On two of those plates, dated March 19th and April 7th, a tiny, faint dot of light made its appearance. It was there. It was undeniable. It was a world 3 billion miles away, finally stepping into the spotlight. And Percival Lowell missed it. He looked at those plates. He scrutinized them. But he was looking for a giant. He expected Planet X to be a massive, gas-bloated behemoth, something 5 or 10 times the size of Earth. He wanted a planet that would scream, "Here I am, Percival. You were right all along." Instead, Pluto gave him a whisper. Pluto is a small, shy, frozen rock that is smaller than our own moon. To Lowell, it looked like just another dim star, a speck of cosmic dust that wasn't worth his time. The celestial glasses on head incident. This is the astronomical equivalent of spending 4 hours tearing your house apart looking for your glasses while they are perched securely on top of your head. We've all been there. You're looking for the big answer, the life-changing opportunity, or the keys to the minivan, and you ignore the small, quiet truths that are sitting right in front of you because they don't fit your narrative. Lowell died in 1916, a year after those plates were taken. He died thinking he had failed. He died believing that Planet X was still out there, mocking him from the darkness. He never knew that he had already captured the invisible assassin of the solar system. He had the trophy in his hand. He just thought it was a paperweight. It wasn't until 1930, when a young farm boy named Clyde Tombaugh was hired by the Lowell Observatory to finish the hunt, that Pluto was officially discovered. Tombaugh found it using a device called a blink comparator, which is a machine that allows you to flip back and forth between two photos of the same patch of sky to see if anything moves. It's essentially a very high-stakes game of spot the difference. When they finally found Pluto and traced its orbit back, they realized it had been sitting in Lowell's files for 15 years. It was the ultimate "I told you so" from the universe, delivered a decade and a half too late. The identity crisis of a frozen rock. Of course, poor Pluto has had a rough time of it since then. In 1915, it was an oops. In 1930, it was a planet. For 76 years, it enjoyed the prestige of being the 9th member of the exclusive Solar System Club. It had its own mnemonic device. My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas. Pluto was the pizza. Everybody loves the pizza. Then, in 2006, the International Astronomical Union, a group of people who clearly don't believe in the sanctity of childhood memories, decided that Pluto wasn't a real planet anymore. They demoted it to dwarf planet status. Apparently, to be a planet, you have to clear your neighborhood of other debris, and Pluto is a bit of a pack rat. It's the gig economy of the solar system. One day you're a full-time employee with benefits and a pizza-themed legacy, and the next day you're a freelance celestial body with no health insurance and a very small office in the Kuiper Belt. The verdict of the speck. The 1915 pre-discovery of Pluto is a testament to the fact that discovery is 10% equipment and 90% expectation. We see what we expect to see. If you're looking for a monster, you'll miss the mouse. If you're looking for a canal, you'll see one in a pile of rocks. Percival Lowell was a man of the 19th century trying to force the 20th century to fit his romantic ideals. He wanted a universe that was populated, ordered, and grand. He wanted a Mars with cities and a Planet X with gravity that could shake the heavens. The universe, being a bit of a prankster, gave him a cold, lonely rock that didn't care about his mustache or his maps. As you fall asleep, think of that tiny dot on the glass plate in 1915. It was there all along, moving slowly through the dark, waiting for someone to notice. It reminds us that the world is full of things we haven't discovered yet, simply because we're too busy looking for something else. History isn't just a list of things that happened. It's a list of things that people noticed. And in 1915, while the world was shouting at itself over telephones and drowning itself in the Atlantic, a small frozen world was whispering its existence into a telescope in Arizona. We just weren't listening. We were too busy worrying about the pizza. Chapter 8. Pyrex, the science of the sourdough, the window into the oven. The year 1915 was a time when science was being asked to do some remarkably heavy lifting. We were asking it to bend space-time for Albert Einstein, to stretch human voices across the Mojave Desert for Alexander Graham Bell, and to find a tiny frozen rock at the edge of the solar system for Percival Lowell. It was an era of the big idea, the global shift, and the spectacularly expensive project. But while the titans of industry and the wizards of the laboratory were looking at the stars in the trenches, the most revolutionary discovery of the year was taking place in a much more dangerous and unpredictable environment. The American kitchen. You see, for most of human history, the act of baking was a game of blind man's buff played with high-temperature ceramics. If you wanted to cook a Sunday roast or a sourdough loaf, you put it in an earthenware pot or a metal tin, shoved it into a cast-iron cave of fire, and prayed to whichever deity looked most favorably upon carbohydrates. You couldn't see what was happening in there. Cooking was an act of faith. You relied on smells, timers that were mostly based on the length of a church hymn, and a general sense of optimism. If the pot cracked because the temperature changed too quickly, a frequent occurrence known as thermal shock, your dinner ended up as a gritty, ceramic-flavored tragedy. Then came the scientists at Corning Glass Works in New York, and a woman named Bessie, who was tired of her casseroles ending in heartbreak. The lantern that wouldn't quit. To understand the birth of Pyrex, you first have to understand the railroad. In the early 20th century, railroads were the arteries of the world, and those arteries were lit by lanterns. The problem with 19th century glass was that it was incredibly temperamental. If a railroad lantern got hot from the flame inside and then got hit by a drop of cold rain or a stray snowflake, it would shatter instantly. This resulted in dark tracks, confused engineers, and the kind of spectacular train wrecks that make for great newspaper headlines but very poor travel insurance rates. Corning had developed a special kind of glass called no-nex, short for non-expansion. It was a borosilicate glass, which is a fancy way of saying they'd added boron to the mix to make the glass less prone to expanding and contracting when the temperature changed. It was tough, it was clear, and it could handle a blizzard and a flame at the same time without having a nervous breakdown. However, no-nex was almost too good. It was so durable that people weren't breaking enough of it to keep the sales figures climbing. The company had a miracle product and no new places to put it. The battery jar casserole. Enter Jesse Littleton, a physicist at Corning. One afternoon in 1913, Jesse went home to his wife, Bessie Littleton, and brought her a present. Now, most husbands bring home flowers, or perhaps a nice piece of jewelry if they've forgotten an anniversary. Jesse brought home the bottom of a sawed-off glass battery jar made of no-necks. He told Bessie, "Here, try baking a cake in this." Now Bessie could have reacted in several ways. She could have asked why her husband was bringing industrial waste into her kitchen, or she could have wondered if he'd finally cracked under the pressure of measuring light refraction. Instead, she took the sawed-off battery jar, whipped up a sponge cake, and slid it into the oven. The result was a revelation. Not only did the glass not shatter, but the cake baked faster and more evenly than any cake she had ever made in her ceramic dishes. Because the glass was clear, she could actually see the bottom of the cake browning. She could watch the sourdough rise. She had been given a window into the mystery of the oven. Bessie told Jesse that he needed to stop worrying about railroads and start worrying about Sunday dinner. The birth of a king and a pie. By 1915, Corning had refined the formula. They removed some of the lead because, while lead makes glass look pretty, it's not the best seasoning for a pot roast, and officially launched the brand Pyrex. The name itself is a bit of a linguistic mystery. Some say it was because the first product was a pie dish, and they added Rex because it's Latin for king, making it the king of pies. Others suggest it was just a play on the word pyrite. Regardless of the etymology, Pyrex became the first time that high science moved into the cupboard. Suddenly, every housewife in America was a laboratory technician. You weren't just making dinner. You were observing a thermal reaction through a borosilicate barrier. Pyrex was marketed as the ultimate hygienic miracle. It didn't absorb odors, it didn't rust, and most importantly, you could see the dirt. In an era where germ theory was finally becoming popular, the ability to see that your dish was actually clean was a major selling point. The spectacle of the sourdough. The true genius of Pyrex, however, was that it turned cooking into a spectacle. For the first time, you could watch a sourdough starter go from a sluggish gray blob to a golden, bubbly masterpiece in real time. You could see the layers of a casserole merging in a bubbling, cheese-covered dance. It changed the way we thought about food. It took the invisible assassin of heat and made it visible. It turned the oven from a dark, scary box into a theater of chemistry. It also meant that you could watch your dinner fail in high definition. If your soufflé collapsed, you didn't have to wait until you took it out of the oven to be disappointed. You could watch the tragedy unfold through the glass, frame by painful frame. The physics of the Sunday roast. Glass is a poor conductor of heat, but a great radiator of it. In a Pyrex dish, the radiant heat from the oven walls passes straight through the glass and hits the food directly. This is why Bessie's cake baked so fast. It was essentially getting a suntan from the inside of the oven. The verdict of the kitchen. By the end of 1915, Pyrex was flying off the shelves. It was the space-time shuffle applied to the kitchen counter. It was proof that the Industrial Revolution wasn't just about steam engines and machine guns. It was about making the domestic life more efficient, more transparent, and significantly more scientific. As 1915 drew to a close, the world was a messy place. The trenches were still deep, the U-boats were still lurking, and Einstein was still trying to explain why the stars were out of place. But in kitchens across the country, people were sitting down to meals they had actually seen cook. They were using railroad technology to bake their bread in lantern glass to serve their stew. It reminds us that history isn't just made by the people who lead armies or discover planets. Sometimes it's made by a woman who's tired of her pots breaking and a man who's smart enough to bring home a battery jar instead of a bouquet. So, as you drift off to sleep, think of the humble glass casserole dish sitting in your cupboard. It's not just a place to put your leftovers, it's a piece of 1915 science. It's a survivor of the railroads, a cousin to the lantern, and a testament to the fact that even in the middle of a world-ending war, someone, somewhere, was still trying to figure out how to make a better sponge cake. And that, in the long run, might be the most important breakthrough of all. Section 3. The American Screen and the Shadow. Chapter 9. The Birth of a Nation, the Silver Screen's Dark Stain. By 1915, the moving picture had grown out of its awkward phase. No longer was it merely a 5-minute novelty of a train pulling into a station which, to be fair, had terrified early audiences so thoroughly they practically trampled each other to avoid being run over by a two-dimensional locomotive. By 1915, the cinema had decided it was no longer a sideshow attraction. It was an art form. And like most art forms in the hands of ambitious men, it immediately decided to see how much trouble it could cause. The man leading this charge was D.W. Griffith, a director who possessed a visionary mind, a flair for the dramatic, and a moral compass that appears to have been calibrated by a magnetic storm in a scrapyard. In February 1915, he released The Birth of a Nation. It was the first true blockbuster, a film so massive, so technical, and so profoundly misguided that it remains the most uncomfortable milestone in the history of light and shadow. The Master of the Lens. Before Griffith, movies were largely stationary affairs. The camera sat still, like a bored relative at a piano recital, and the actors moved around in front of it, waving their arms with the frantic energy of people trying to flag down a departing bus. Griffith changed all that. He realized that the camera could be a character in itself. He pioneered the close-up, allowing audiences to see a tear on an actress's cheek or the subtle twitch of a villain's mustache, features that were previously reserved for people sitting in the front row of a theater with very expensive binoculars. He utilized cross-cutting, jumping between two scenes to build tension, such as a hero racing to the rescue while the victim is being threatened. This effectively invented the modern action sequence, proving that you could make an audience's heart race simply by showing them two different things happening at the same time. He even used tracking shots, putting the camera on a moving platform to follow the action. For the first time, the audience wasn't just watching a story, they were in it. Griffith had essentially invented the language of modern cinema. He gave us the grammar, the punctuation, and the exclamation points of the silver screen. The problem, however, was what he chose to say with that language. A masterpiece of malice. The Birth of a Nation is a 3-hour epic about the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era that followed. It was based on a novel called The Klansman, a title that should have given the censors a bit of a hint that the story wasn't going to be a light-hearted romp through the meadows of brotherly love. Griffith took this narrative and, with his technical genius, turned it into a heroic origin story for the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, in Griffith's version of history, the men in the white hoods weren't a domestic terror organization. They were the Knights of the South, riding to the rescue to protect civilization from the supposed chaos of newly freed black citizens and carpet-bagging Northerners. It was a staggering display of cinematic propaganda. By using realistic costumes, massive battle scenes involving thousands of extras, and a soaring orchestral score, Griffith made a hateful lie look like a historical truth. He used the invisible assassin of the camera to rewrite the past in a way that felt as real as the chair the audience was sitting in. It was the first time the world realized that a camera is not a neutral observer. It's a storyteller with an agenda, and it can lie more convincingly than any politician with a megaphone. The $2 Riot. The film was a sensation. In 1915, most movies cost a nickel or a dime to see at a Nickelodeon. Griffith, however, charged $2 a seat. In modern currency, that's about $60 for a movie ticket. It was an outrageous sum, the kind of price that suggested you weren't just watching a film. You were participating in a religious experience, and people paid it. They lined up around the block. They sat in darkened theaters and watched the heroic Klan ride across the screen, and they cheered. The film was the first ever screened at the White House. Woodrow Wilson, the man who was too proud to fight in Europe, but apparently not too proud to enjoy a 3-hour celebration of white supremacy, supposedly remarked that the film was like writing history with lightning. It is a beautiful quote for a terrible occasion. History written with lightning is bright, it's dramatic, and it tends to burn everything it touches. The NAACP and other civil rights groups protested the film, rightly pointing out that it was a direct incitement to violence. They saw the danger immediately. When you turn hate into entertainment, you give it a seat at the dinner table. You make it respectable. You make it part of the blockbuster experience. The power of the projectionist. In 1915, a film reel was made of nitrocellulose, which is essentially solidified gunpowder that has been taught to carry pictures. It was incredibly flammable. If the projector jammed for more than a few seconds, the heat from the lamp would cause the film to explode. Perhaps the universe was trying to tell us something about the content of the reels, but we were too busy eating our popcorn to notice. The shadow over the future. The legacy of The Birth of a Nation is a dark one. It didn't just break box office records, it effectively rebooted the Ku Klux Klan, which had been largely defunct for decades. Inspired by the glamour of the film, a group of men gathered later that year at Stone Mountain in Georgia to burn a cross and declare the rebirth of their organization, a tragedy we will discuss in Chapter 11. Griffith had proven that the silver screen was the most powerful tool ever invented for shaping the human mind. He showed that you could take a group of thugs and, with the right lighting and a swelling violin section, turn them into heroes in the eyes of millions. He had discovered that the modern epic required a villain, and he had chosen his fellow Americans. It is the great irony of 1915. At the same moment, Einstein was using his mind to reveal the grand, elegant curves of the universe. D.W. Griffith was using his mind to flatten the complexities of human history into a black and white caricature of hate. The verdict of the screen. As the lights came up in theaters across America, the world was a different place. We had learned how to dream together in the dark. We had learned how to tell stories that spanned generations and moved millions. But we had also learned that the silver screen could be a dark stain. Griffith died years later, somewhat confused by the fact that the world had turned against his masterpiece. He thought he was being a truth teller. He thought he was just showing things as they were. He was the first victim of his own technology, a man who couldn't tell the difference between the light on the screen and the reality of the world. As you drift off to sleep, consider the flickering light of the cinema. It can show us the stars. It can show us the bottom of the ocean. And it can show us the best of ourselves. But it can also cast a very long shadow. In 1915, we stepped into the theater of the 20th century, and we haven't quite found the exit sign yet. We're still watching the lightning, and we're still trying to figure out how to keep from getting burned. Chapter 10. The Sinking of the Eastland, the 20-Foot Tragedy. If the first 9 chapters of 1915 have taught us anything, it's that the invisible assassin of gravity is a remarkably patient hunter. It doesn't always need a vast, churning ocean or a jagged iceberg to do its work. Sometimes it doesn't even need you to leave the house. In July 1915, gravity decided to prove that it could orchestrate a maritime catastrophe in the middle of a major American city, in water so shallow you could nearly stand up in it, while the victims were still close enough to the shore to smell the roasting peanuts from a nearby street vendor. The SS Eastland was a ship that possessed all the structural stability of a bicycle being ridden by a panicked squirrel. Known as the Speed Queen of the Lakes, she was a narrow, sleek excursion steamer designed for speed and vanity rather than the boring practical business of staying upright. She had a reputation among sailors for being cranky, which is nautical speak for this boat has a death wish and might try to flip over if you sneeze too loudly near the railing. But on July 24th, 1915, the Eastland wasn't worried about speed. She was docked in the Chicago River right between LaSalle and Clark Streets, preparing for the annual Western Electric employee picnic. It was supposed to be a day of leisure, of starched collars and summer dresses, of ginger ale and the kind of forced camaraderie that only a corporate outing can provide. The irony of safety. Now, here is where the hilarious history takes a turn into the truly absurd. Only 3 years prior, the Titanic had introduced the world to the idea that not having enough lifeboats was a bit of a social faux pas. In response, the United States passed the La Follette Seamen's Act of 1915. It was a piece of legislation written with the best of intentions and the worst of mathematical oversight. It required all passenger ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The owners of the Eastland, being law-abiding citizens with a ship that already had the balance of a drunkard on a tightrope, dutifully piled several tons of heavy wooden lifeboats and steel davits onto the top deck. Take a moment to appreciate the physics here. You have a ship that is already top-heavy and narrow-beamed. To make it safer, you add several tons of weight to the very highest point of the vessel. It's like trying to make a pencil more stable by taping a brick to the eraser. The invisible assassin looked at the Eastland and realized that the human race had essentially done half the work for him. The death roll at the dock. By 7 a.m., the Eastland was packed. Over 2,500 people had crowded onto the decks. The band was playing, children were running around with sticky fingers, and the air was filled with the anticipatory hum of people who were looking forward to a day away from the assembly line. The ship began to list. Now, a list is a common occurrence on a ship, but the Eastland's list was more of a persistent leaning, like a teenager trying to look cool at a bus stop. The crew tried to compensate by filling the ballast tanks with river water, but the Eastland was having none of it. As the ship leaned toward the river, the passengers, in a display of the kind of herd instinct that keeps the insurance industry in business, all rushed to the high side to see what was happening. Then a passing ship drew their attention back to the port side, and the crowd surged across the deck. That was the final straw. At 7:28 a.m., while still tied to the dock with thick hemp ropes, the Eastland simply gave up. She didn't sink in the traditional sense. She just rolled over on her side like a tired dog looking for a belly rub. The physics of the folly. In 20 feet of water, a ship that is 80 feet wide cannot actually sink. It can only become a very large, very damp obstacle. But for the 2,500 people trapped inside the palace of the lower decks, those 20 feet of water were as lethal as the middle of the Atlantic. The silent catastrophe. The horror of the Eastland was its proximity to the mundane. People on the sidewalk, just feet away, watched in stunned silence as a massive steamer turned into a capsized tomb in less than 2 minutes. There was no time for women and children first. There was no time for those shiny new lifeboats to be lowered. In fact, the lifeboats on the top side simply slid down the deck, crushing people as they went. The ropes holding the ship to the dock didn't snap immediately. They held fast, pulling the ship into a more awkward angle and trapping hundreds of people against the bulkhead. Inside the hull, the mahogany furniture and the grand pianos, the very things that were supposed to signal luxury, became sliding blocks of death. While the Titanic was a grand tragedy played out on a lonely stage of ice and stars, the Eastland was a gritty urban nightmare. Men in business suits jumped into the murky, oily water of the Chicago River to pull survivors out. Passers-by formed human chains. It was a disaster that happened in the shadows of skyscrapers, witnessed by people who had just been complaining about the price of their morning coffee. The verdict of the river. When the mud settled, 844 people were dead. More people died on the Eastland that morning than had perished on the Titanic's passenger list. Entire families were wiped out. 22 entire families vanished in the time it takes to boil an egg. The aftermath was a predictable circus of finger-pointing. The owners blamed the government for the lifeboat law. The government blamed the owners for the ballast tanks. The engineers blamed the crowd for moving too much. In the end, no one was held criminally responsible. It was categorized as an act of God, though I suspect the invisible assassin would prefer to take the credit for himself. The Eastland remained in the river for weeks, a giant rusted middle finger to the concept of maritime safety. Eventually, they righted her, renamed her the USS Wilmette, and turned her into a naval training ship. There is something profoundly cynical about the human spirit that looks at a vessel that drowned 800 people at a picnic and says, well, let's paint it gray and teach some teenagers how to fire a cannon on it. The legacy of the lean. The sinking of the Eastland is the forgotten disaster of 1915, overshadowed by the Lusitania and the trenches of Ypres. But it remains the most potent reminder that we are never quite as safe as we think we are. We build unsinkable ships and then weigh them down with safety equipment until they tip over. We create laws to prevent one tragedy and accidentally architect the next one. It's the ultimate Twain-esque irony. The people on the Eastland died because we tried too hard to save them from a different disaster. We gave them lifeboats and took away their balance. We gave them a picnic and gave the river a harvest. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps consider the floor beneath you. It feels solid, doesn't it? It feels level. But remember Eastland, the difference between a grand excursion and a vertical tragedy is often just a few hundred people moving to the left at the same time. The world is always leaning. We're all just doing our best to pretend it's not. And if you ever find yourself on a boat in a river and someone tells you it's perfectly safe because of all the extra lifeboats on the roof, maybe just stay on the dock and have an extra bag of peanuts. The view is better from the shore, and the water is significantly less mahogany flavored. Chapter 11. The Second KKK, Stone Mountain, and the High Cost of Cosplay. By late 1915, humanity had already spent 10 months proving that it could turn the most sophisticated inventions of the age, the submarine, the airplane, the chemical laboratory, into creative ways to shorten the census. But if the physical world was a mess of shrapnel and chlorine, the psychological world was about to undergo a reboot that would prove a camera lens is far more dangerous than a bayonet. As we discussed in Chapter 9, D.W. Griffith had spent the year showing Americans a 3-hour, $2 epic called The Birth of a Nation. It was a film that took the complicated, bloody, and deeply uncomfortable reality of the American South and deep-fried it in a vat of cinematic nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is a Greek word that roughly translates to the pain of an old wound. But in the hands of a bored salesman with a flair for the dramatic, it becomes something else entirely. A domestic terror organization with a very specific dress code. In November 1915, while the rest of the country was preparing to overeat for Thanksgiving, a man named William Joseph Simmons decided that the best way to celebrate the holiday was to take a few of his friends, a bottle of kerosene, and a massive hunk of granite just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and turn a movie into a lifestyle choice. The Professional Joiner. To understand the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, you have to understand William J. Simmons. Simmons was a man who had spent his life failing at things that required a great deal of effort, but succeeding wildly at things that required a great deal of vibe. He was a failed preacher, a failed salesman, and a professional joiner. Simmons lived in an era of fraternal organizations. Men in 1915 were obsessed with joining clubs where they could wear funny hats, use secret handshakes, and call each other things like Grand Potentate or Exalted Oyster. It was a way for a man who spent all day selling insurance or fixing shoes to feel like a character in a King Arthur legend. Simmons belonged to at least a dozen of these clubs, But his real dream was to start one of his own, one that offered more than just a weekly poker game and a sash. He saw the birth of a nation and had a eureka moment. He realized that Griffith had done all the marketing for him. The movie had provided the costumes, the mythology, and the heroic backstory. All Simmons had to do was provide the application forms and the membership dues. The Thanksgiving Hike. On the night of November 25, 1915, Simmons and 15 other men, including 2 aging members of the original, long-defunct Reconstruction-era Klan, climbed to the top of Stone Mountain. Stone Mountain is a giant, bald dome of granite that looks like the earth had developed a massive gray pimple. It is a lonely, exposed place, perfect for a secret meeting that everyone is supposed to notice. The night was cold, the wind was biting, and the men were lugging a massive wooden cross they had constructed. Now, here is the Twain irony of the situation. The original Ku Klux Klan of the 1860s didn't burn crosses. They were mostly concerned with being ghosts, dressing up in sheets to scare people into believing they were the restless spirits of Confederate dead. The burning cross was an invention of literature and film. It was a visual flourish added by D.W. Griffith because it looked spectacular on a black and white screen. Simmons, a man who clearly couldn't tell the difference between history and a matinee, decided that if it worked in the movies, it would work on the mountain. They doused the wood in kerosene, struck a match, and watched as the invisible assassin of fire consumed the timber. Under the flickering light of a cinematic trope, Simmons declared the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan to be reborn. The mythology of the bedsheet. There is something profoundly ridiculous about a man who believes he is asserting his racial superiority while wearing a laundry accessory over his head. If you give a man a hood, he doesn't become a ghost. He just becomes a man who can't see his own feet and is likely to trip over a rock. It is the ultimate coward's paradox, the desire to be a knight while being too ashamed to show your face. The branding of hate. If the first Klan was a disorganized band of night riders, Simmons' second Klan was a masterpiece of 20th century branding. He was the first person to realize that you could sell hate exactly the same way you sell soap or automobiles. He created a corporate structure he called himself the Imperial Wizard, which sounds like a character from a middle-tier fantasy novel who specializes in losing his keys. Below him were grand dragons, exalted cyclopses, and clatters. They even had their own vocabulary, the clonversation, where they added kyle to the beginning of every word. They met in clonvocations. They read from the chlorine, and they presumably had chlorine dog lunches. It was a linguistic circus designed to make the members feel like they were part of an exclusive ancient mystery, rather than a group of men in Georgia who were mad about the changing world. But the real genius, the dark, cynical genius of 1915, was the commercialization. Simmons realized that the Klan was a gold mine. There was a $10 initiation fee, the Klecktockert. There were dues, and most importantly, there was the official uniform. You couldn't just bring your own sheet from home. That would be unprofessional. You had to buy the official Simmons-approved $6.50 polyester blend robe. By the early 1920s, the Klan would have millions of members, not because everyone was a committed ideologue, but because Simmons had hired a public relations firm, the Southern Publicity Association, to sell Americanism like it was a brand of breakfast cereal. They took a percentage of every robe sold. It was the world's first multi-level marketing scheme for domestic terrorism. The shadow on the granite. The tragedy of Stone Mountain wasn't just the fire that night. It was the fact that it turned a movie theater fantasy into a tangible political reality. The invisible assassin here was disinformation. By 1915, the world was moving too fast for many people. Einstein was bending the stars, the telephone was shrinking the country, and the old ways of the 19th century were being ground into the mud of Ypres. In times of great change, people tend to look backward. They look for a golden age that never actually existed, a time when things were simple and everyone knew their place. Simmons and Griffith gave them a fake history to cling to. They turned the Klan into a shield against the 20th century. Stone Mountain itself would eventually be carved with the images of Confederate leaders, a project that took decades and was largely funded and supported by the very movement Simmons started that night. It became a permanent granite monument to a temporary kerosene-soaked delusion. The verdict of the Hood. As the fire on Stone Mountain burned out and the men hiked back down to their normal lives, they left behind a stain that would take generations to scrub away. They had proven that you don't need a logical argument to start a movement. You just need a costume, a secret handshake, and a movie to tell you who your enemies are. It is a reminder that while science was giving us Pyrex and long-distance calls, the human heart was still perfectly capable of retreating into the dark. We are a species that can weigh the atoms, but still be fooled by a piece of cheap fabric and a catchy title. So, as you drift off to sleep, think of the imperial wizard and his 15 friends shivering on a rock in Georgia. They thought they were the knights of the air, but they were just men who had mistaken a flickering light in a theater for a divine revelation. History is full of people who try to rewrite the past because they're afraid of the future. But the future, like 1916, is already greasing its gears, and it doesn't care how many secret handshakes you know. Chapter 12. Rocky Mountain National Park. Nature in its original packaging. By the midpoint of 1915, the human race was essentially a collective of pyromaniacs locked in a library. We had spent the better part of a year figuring out how to turn the air into poison, the ocean into a graveyard, and the silver screen into a billboard for bad ideas. If an alien observer had drifted past Earth in a saucer that summer, they would have seen a planet covered in smoke, wire, and people in very uncomfortable hats shouting at each other across 3,000 miles of copper. They would have likely hit the lock button on their spaceship doors and kept right on moving toward Saturn. However, in the midst of this global tantrum, a small group of Americans decided to do something truly radical. They decided to leave something alone. While Europe was busy turning its landscape into a series of muddy craters, the United States decided to take 265,000 acres of high-altitude real estate in Colorado and put it in a metaphorical glass case. On January 26, 1915, Woodrow Wilson, a man whose face always suggested he was mentally correcting your grammar, signed the act that created Rocky Mountain National Park. It was a rare moment of sanity in a year that was otherwise losing its mind. It was the American government saying, Look, we're probably going to have to join that disaster in Europe eventually, so we should probably save at least one mountain range before we accidentally blow up the rest of the planet. The prophet of the peaks. The man responsible for this was Enos Mills, often called the John Muir of the Rockies. Mills was a man who possessed the kind of singular, obsessive focus that in any other context would have earned him a very quiet room with padded walls. He moved to the Colorado mountains when he was 14 and apparently decided that the society of trees and mountain lions was vastly superior to that of human beings, a sentiment that in 1915 was hard to argue with. Mills spent decades lobbying for the park. He was a professional enthusiast. He would corner politicians and lecture them on the majesty of the subalpine tundra until they either agreed to preserve it or jumped out of a window to escape. He understood a fundamental truth that the rest of the world was ignoring. Wilderness is not a luxury. It's a spare tire for the human soul. When the civilized world gets a flat, and in 1915 we were riding on the rims, you need a place where the air hasn't been through a factory, and the only social hierarchy involves which bear is currently standing on the largest rock. 265,000 acres of vertical ego. The park itself is a masterclass in geographical arrogance. It's 415 square miles of land that starts at very high and goes straight up to impossible. It is centered around Long's Peak, a 14,259-foot slab of granite that looks like it was designed by a deity who wanted to test the lung capacity of anyone foolish enough to try and walk on it. In 1915, the concept of a national park was still a relatively new American invention. We were the first nation to decide that land could have value, even if you didn't dig it up, chop it down, or build a shopping mall on it. It was a revolutionary idea, the belief that a mountain belongs to everyone, which in practice meant it belonged to no one, which in turn meant the squirrels finally had some job security. But preserving the land was only half the battle. The other half was convincing people to actually go there. The 1915 Tourism Survival Guide. In the early 20th century, hiking was not a casual activity involving moisture-wicking fabrics and $200 boots. It involved wool trousers that weighed 30 pounds when wet, boots made of stiffened leather and spite, and a general sense that if you didn't encounter a grizzly bear, you weren't really trying. The Model T versus the mountain. If you wanted to visit Rocky Mountain National Park in 1915, you didn't just hop in a sleek SUV with heated seats and a GPS. You climbed into a Model T Ford, a vehicle that possessed the horsepower of a particularly lethargic pony and the suspension of a wooden crate. Driving a Model T into the Rockies was an act of high-stakes gambling. There were no paved roads. There were suggestions made of dirt and gravel. Because the Model T used a gravity-fed fuel system, if the hill was too steep, the gas would stop flowing to the engine. The solution? You had to drive up the mountains backward. Imagine, if you will, a line of tourists in 1915, dressed in their Sunday best, reversing their way up a 10,000-foot pass, while their radiators screamed like banshees and their wives clutched their sunbonnets in terror. It was a spectacle of absurdity that perfectly encapsulated the era. We were using the latest technology to experience the oldest parts of the world, and we were doing it in the most inconvenient way possible. The invisible assassin of altitude. Once the tourists arrived, they had to deal with the thin air. At 12,000 feet, the atmosphere is about as thick as the plot of a silent movie. People who had spent their entire lives at sea level in Ohio suddenly found that their brains were being deprived of oxygen, leading to a condition known as high-altitude delirium. This often resulted in tourists having profound philosophical realizations about the nature of the universe, most of which were forgotten the moment they descended back to the gift shop, or simply deciding that the view would be much better if they could just lie down in the dirt for an hour. It was the ultimate space-time shuffle on a local level. Einstein said, "Time is relative, and in the Rockies, 10 more minutes of hiking is a unit of time that can actually last 3 hours." The verdict of the peaks. Woodrow Wilson's signature on the Rocky Mountain National Park Act was a rare win for the future, while the Iron Beasts, which we'll meet in the next chapter, were preparing to tear up the earth. The American government had decided to keep a small portion of the planet in its original packaging. It was an admission that progress is a hungry beast, and if we don't build a fence around the things that matter, we'll eventually wake up in a world that is nothing but parking lots and poison gas. Rocky Mountain National Park was a message in a bottle sent to us from 1915. It said, "Try not to ruin everything. We saved this for you, and it was really hard to get the Model T up there backward." As the sun sets over the Continental Divide, the mountains don't care about the U-boats or the fallen empires. They don't care about the invisible assassin or the space-time shuffle. They just sit there, cold and indifferent and magnificent, reminding us that while humans are very good at making history, nature is much better at making a point. And so, as we leave the fresh air of Colorado behind, we must turn our gaze back to the darkness. The gentleman's war is over. The chemical age is here, and the machines are starting to grow teeth. Section 4. The Iron Beasts Arrive. Chapter 13. Little Willie, the First Tank. By the autumn of 1915, the progress of man had hit a literal and metaphorical wall, or rather, a ditch. The Western Front had become a 400-mile-long, 6-foot-deep subterranean apartment complex, where the rent was paid in human life, and the amenities included constant dampness and neighbors who expressed their disagreements with hand grenades. The generals, sitting in their chateaus with their maps and their sherry, were beginning to realize that the traditional charge of the Light Brigade approach to warfare had a slight flaw. A machine gun doesn't care about your family lineage, the luster of your horse's coat, or how dashing you look in a sash. The horse, for so long the undisputed king of the battlefield, had officially been demoted to expensive snack. If you sent a horse into no man's land, you ended up with a very dead horse and a very lonely rider. The human being, while slightly more agile, was essentially a soft, pink bag of water that stood no chance against a blizzard of lead. What the world needed was a miracle of engineering, a motorized, ironclad middle finger that could roll over barbed wire and ignore the frantic knocking of a Maxim gun. Enter the British Admiralty. Yes, the Navy. Because when the Army is stuck in the mud and refuses to admit that their tactics are 3 centuries out of date, you naturally turn to the sailors to build you a vehicle for the land. The Landships Committee Churchill's second act. Winston Churchill, having survived the political fallout of the Gallipoli gamble, Chapter 3, with his ego remarkably intact, decided that if he couldn't sail ships into Constantinople, he would sail them across France. He formed the Land Ships Committee. The very name suggests a level of Victorian grandeur that is entirely at odds with the reality of what they were building. They wanted a ship that could navigate the dry sea. They didn't start with a sleek, aerodynamic predator of the plains. No, they started with a prototype called the Number 1 Lincoln Machine, later affectionately and somewhat mockingly dubbed Little Willie. Little Willie was named after the German Crown Prince Wilhelm, because the British had reached a point of war weariness, where their primary psychological weapon was naming their failures after the enemy's children. Little Willie was many things, but graceful was not one of them. It was a 12-ton box of boilerplate and rivets, sitting atop a set of tracks that looked like they had been stolen from an oversized farm tractor. A motorized tea kettle with an identity crisis. Little Willie was the mechanical embodiment of a first draft. It was powered by a 105-horsepower Daimler engine, which sounds impressive until you realize it had to move 12 tons of steel. Its top speed was a blistering 2 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, a determined tortoise with a slight limp could have successfully outrun the future of mechanized warfare. It was loud, it was hot, it was cramped, and it had a very peculiar feature, a pair of massive tail wheels at the back. These were designed to help the machine steer and to keep it from tipping over backward when it tried to climb a trench. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a motorized tea kettle that had decided to go for a very slow, very aggressive stroll. The internal environment of Little Willie was a master class in human misery. The engine sat in the middle of the compartment, unshielded. This meant the crew, which consisted of 6 men who presumably didn't value their hearing or their skin, spent their time in a cloud of oil smoke, deafening noise, and temperatures that could regularly reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was like going to war inside a giant, vibrating toaster. The physics of the pivot, one of the greatest challenges for Little Willie, was the center of gravity. If the machine was too long, it couldn't turn. If it was too short, it would nosedive into the first trench it encountered like a clumsy drunk falling off a curb. The engineers spent 1915 playing a high-stakes game of Don't Tip the Iron Box, which eventually led to the mother prototype and the iconic rhomboid shape we know today. The Great Water Tank Ruse. In December 1915, the project was so secret that the British government couldn't even tell the people building it what it was. They needed a cover story. They told the factory workers at William Foster and Company that they were building mobile water carriers for the Russian army. When it came time to ship these mysterious boxes to the front, they needed a short, easy-to-write word to stencil on the side. They considered water carrier, but WC was already taken by the British term for a toilet, and even the Admiralty realized that sending a water closet into battle might send the wrong message to the troops. They settled on the word tank. It was a brilliant piece of accidental branding. The word tank suggested something heavy, utilitarian, and utterly boring. It conjured images of plumbers and livestock hydration, not a steel beast that would eventually render the trench obsolete. The name stuck so well that a century later we still use it, even though nobody has mistaken a leopard tube for a place to store their rainwater in a very long time. The death of the cavalry. While little Willie never actually saw combat, he was too top-heavy, and his tracks kept falling off, a common symptom of being version 1.0. He proved the concept. He was the invisible assassin of the old world order. For thousands of years, the elite of the military had been men on horses. The cavalryman was a creature of status, of speed, and of social standing. In 1915, little Willie rolled out of a workshop in Lincoln and quietly informed the cavalry that their services were no longer required. You cannot argue with a 12-ton iron box. You cannot intimidate it with a polished sword. You cannot outshine it with a well-groomed mane. The tank represented the final industrialization of slaughter. It took the messy personal business of a bayonet charge and turned it into a matter of internal combustion and gear ratios. It was the moment the gentleman's war was replaced by the mechanic's war. The verdict of the gearbox. As 1915 drew to a close, the British were already working on Big Willie, also known as Mother, which would eventually become the Mark I tank. They had solved the track problem, ditched the tail wheels, and embraced the rhomboid shape that allowed the machine to climb over the very trenches that had halted civilization for a year. Little Willie, meanwhile, was relegated to the scrap heap of history, a forgotten prototype that paved the way for the iron beasts of 1916. But we should remember him. He was the first time we looked at a stalemate and said, what if we just drove over it in a very slow, very hot oven? He reminds us that every great revolution starts as a clunky, smoke-belching failure. He reminds us that the Navy is always happy to build things for the land if it means they get a bigger budget. And he reminds us that in the age of the machine, the only thing more dangerous than a bullet is a secret project with a clever nickname. So, as you fall asleep, listen for the ghostly clatter of tracks in a muddy field. That's the sound of the 19th century being ground into the dirt. The horse is gone, the landship is here, and the Western Front is about to find out that neutrality isn't the only thing that can't stop an iron cigar. Chapter 14. The Fokker Interrupter Gear. The Deadly Art of Not Shooting Yourself. If the creation of Little Willie on the ground, Chapter 13, proved that the British were willing to ride into battle inside a vibrating toaster, the developments in the sky during 1915 proved that the Germans were equally committed to making the clouds a very dangerous place to have a philosophical realization. In the early months of the war, the Air Force was less of a military branch and more of a collection of eccentric hobbyists who happened to own flying lawn chairs made of canvas, wood, and piano wire. These early aviators were the Knights of the Air, a title that sounds remarkably romantic, until you realize that their primary mission was to fly over enemy lines and right down where the other side was hiding their lunch. Combat, in those early days, was a polite, almost accidental affair. If two opposing pilots crossed paths, they might wave, they might shake a fist. Occasionally, if they were feeling particularly aggressive, they might take a pot shot at each other with a service revolver, or in one truly ambitious case, throw a literal brick. It was a war of gestures and masonry, a aerial circus where the most dangerous thing in the sky was usually the engine's tendency to spontaneously disassemble itself mid-flight. But by 1915, the gentleman's war in the sky was about to be interrupted by a piece of engineering so clever it made the act of murder feel like a synchronized dance. The propeller conundrum. The problem with putting a machine gun on a plane was essentially a problem of geometry and self-preservation. You wanted the gun to fire forward because that's where the pilot was looking, and inconveniently, where the enemy usually was. However, sitting directly in front of the pilot was a large wooden propeller, spinning at several thousand revolutions per minute. If you mounted a machine gun behind that propeller and pulled the trigger, you would achieve two things. First, you would put several holes in the enemy, and second, you would instantly turn your own propeller into a collection of very expensive toothpicks, resulting in a sudden and dramatic transition from pilot to glider enthusiast. The French tried to solve this with a bit of Gallic brute force. A pilot named Roland Garros, the man whose name is now synonymous with tennis, for reasons that remain a mystery to anyone who knows he spent his time shooting things, decided to bolt steel wedges to the back of his propeller blades. The idea was that if a bullet hit the blade, the steel wedge would deflect it. It worked mostly. It also meant that about 10% of your bullets were ricocheting off your own plane in random directions, turning the act of firing into a game of aerial Russian roulette. Garros eventually had an engine failure, landed behind German lines, and the Germans captured his plane. They looked at his armored propeller, scratched their heads, and sent for a young Dutchman named Anthony Fokker, the man who played both sides of the wind. Anthony Fokker was a man who didn't care much for flags, but he cared deeply about things that could fly. He was 25 years old, possessed a mind like a Swiss watch, and had already built a successful aircraft factory in Germany because the Dutch were too sensible to invest in flying contraptions. When the German military handed him Garros's plane and told him to copy the armored propeller, Fokker looked at it and reportedly said something to the effect of, "This is a terrible idea. Why don't we just make the gun stop firing when the blade is in the way?" It sounds simple, doesn't it? It's the kind of idea that makes everyone else in the room feel like they've been wearing their shoes on the wrong feet for 20 years. But in 1915, this was the invisible assassin of the air. The interrupter gear, a jump rope for bullets. Fokker developed what we now call the synchronizer gear, or more dramatically, the interrupter gear. Imagine a child jumping rope. If the child is smart and values their shins, they only jump when the rope is at the bottom. Fokker did the same for the machine gun. He attached a cam to the engine's crankshaft. Every time a propeller blade was about to pass in front of the gun barrel, the cam would push a lever that interrupted the gun's firing mechanism. The gun would only fire when the space between the blades was clear. The result was a stream of lead that seemed to magically pass through a spinning solid object without touching it. It turned the airplane from a scouting platform into a weapon. For the first time, the pilot didn't have to aim a pistol or throw a brick. He simply pointed his entire airplane at the target and pulled the trigger. He became the bullet. The mechanics of mayhem. The Fokker Eindecker, the monoplane, was the first plane equipped with this gear. It wasn't actually a very good airplane. It handled like a shopping cart with a missing wheel. But it didn't have to be good. It just had to be the only thing in the sky that could shoot straight ahead without committing suicide. The Fokker Scourge. From mid-1915 to early 1916, the Fokker Scourge decimated the Allied air forces. British and French pilots, still flying their pushers, planes with the engines in the back, or their unarmed scouts, found themselves being hunted by a magic German plane that could dive on them and pepper them with lead with professional precision. The British called their own BE-2 reconnaissance planes Fokker fodder. It was a grim time to be a knight of the air. The romantic notion of the aerial duel was replaced by the reality of being sniped from above by a man who had a cam and a lever on his side. The Allies were so desperate to find out how the magic worked that they offered a reward for any pilot who could capture a Fokker intact. They eventually got one when a German pilot got lost in the fog and landed at a British airfield, presumably asking for directions to Berlin and instead receiving a very long interrogation and a permanent change in his travel plans. The chivalry of the machine. The introduction of the interrupter gear effectively ended the era of gentlemanly flight. Once you can kill someone with a button, you stop seeing them as a fellow traveler in the clouds and start seeing them as a target. Twain would have had a field day with the irony of it. We called these men knights, but we gave them industrialized lances that fired 500 rounds per minute. We spoke of their chivalry, while they perfected the art of shooting an unsuspecting teenager in the back from 1,000 feet up. It was the same contradiction we saw in the trenches. The more civilized our technology became, the more primal our methods of slaughter grew. Fokker himself became a millionaire, proving that the best way to get rich in the 20th century was to solve a problem that nobody knew they had, specifically the problem of how to kill people more efficiently while sitting down. The verdict of the propeller. By the end of 1915, the technology treadmill was in full sprint. The Allies eventually developed their own synchronization gears, and the skies became a back-and-forth race of engineering. Bigger engines, more guns, faster turns. But the Fokker interrupter gear was the moment the airplane grew teeth. It was the moment the sky stopped being a sanctuary and became just another theater for the global demolition derby. It proved that in the age of the machine, the person who wins isn't necessarily the person with the most courage, but the person with the best timing. As you fall asleep, imagine the sound of a 1915 rotary engine, a rhythmic, oily thrumming, and behind it, the staccato pop-pop-pop of a gun firing through the gaps of a spinning blade. It's the heartbeat of a new kind of war, where the only thing between you and the abyss is a small, greasy piece of metal that knows exactly when to say no. History is a series of interruptions. Sometimes it's a politician, sometimes it's a hurricane. And in 1915, it was a cam on an engine that allowed us to aim our aggression with the precision of a surgeon and the heart of a hatchet. Chapter 15. The Liberty Bell's Final Tour, a 10,000-mile participation trophy. While the rest of the world was busy perfecting the art of turning the human body into a casualty statistic, the United States was engaged in a project that was uniquely, profoundly American. We were taking a giant broken piece of bronze on a 10,000-mile train ride. In 1915, the Liberty Bell was already a celebrity, but it was a celebrity of the has-been variety. It was old, it was silent, and it possessed a structural failure so famous that we had successfully rebranded it as a symbol of national character. It's a very American move, really. If something breaks, don't fix it. Just tell everyone it was meant to look that way as a metaphor for the cracks in the human condition. The occasion for this cross-country jaunt was the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. San Francisco, as you recall, had been a smoldering pile of tectonic leftovers just 9 years prior, and the city was desperate to prove to the world that it had successfully rebuilt itself without the aid of any more unscheduled urban renewals. They wanted the Liberty Bell as the star attraction, a sort of heavy metallic mascot to remind everyone that despite the fires and the tremors, the Republic was still ringing, even if the bell itself hadn't actually made a sound since the 1840s without risking a total catastrophic meltdown. The Steel Rail Pilgrimage. On July 5, 1915, the bell was hoisted out of Independence Hall in Philadelphia and placed onto a specially designed gondola car on the Pennsylvania Railroad. This wasn't just any train car. It was a rolling shrine. It featured an elaborate system of springs to protect the bell from the invisible assassin of vibration, a massive mahogany frame, and enough electric lights to make it visible from the next county. The itinerary was a logistical nightmare that would have made a modern tour manager weep into their spreadsheets. The bell traveled through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Nebraska, Wyoming, and eventually down the coast of California. It visited hundreds of towns. In 1915, if the Liberty Bell came to your town, it was the biggest thing to happen since the invention of sliced bread, which technically hadn't been invented yet, so it was actually the biggest thing ever. Farmers would leave their fields, shopkeepers would lock their doors, and schools would let out so that everyone could stand by the tracks and catch a glimpse of a 2,000-pound silent object as it hissed past at 20 miles per hour. It was the ultimate 20th century pilgrimage, a journey to see a relic that didn't do anything, but which everyone agreed was very important. The kissing of the bronze. The reception the bell received was somewhere between a religious revival and a circus. In many towns, people didn't just want to look at the bell, they wanted to touch it. There are accounts of mothers lifting their infants to kiss the cold bronze, presumably hoping that some of that liberty would rub off on the child and prevent them from growing up to be a tax collector. In Chicago, the crowds were so dense that the police had to form a human wedge just to keep the train moving. In the Midwest, veterans of the Civil War, men who were now in their 70s and 80s, with whiskers that could tangle a bird, stood at attention and wept as the bell passed. It was a strange, bittersweet moment in American history. These people were looking at a symbol of freedom, while the world across the Atlantic was proving that freedom was a very fragile thing indeed. There was a sense that the bell was a tether to a simpler time, a time before U-boats and chlorine gas, a time when the greatest threat to the Union was a disagreement over tea taxes rather than a global demolition derby. The physics of the crack, the Liberty Bell, is made of a bell metal that is approximately 77% copper and 23% tin. However, the original casting was a bit of a disaster, containing traces of lead, zinc, and a healthy dose of bad luck. The famous crack is technically a series of fractures that occurred because the metal was too brittle. In 1915, the engineers were terrified that one bad bump on a Nebraska rail joint would turn the symbol of America into a very expensive collection of bronze paperweights. San Francisco, the palace of fine arts and silent bells. When the bell finally arrived in San Francisco in mid-July, it was greeted with a parade that made the previous 3,000 miles look like a casual stroll. It was installed in the Pennsylvania Pavilion at the Exposition, surrounded by flowers, flags, and a constant rotation of armed guards whose primary job was to make sure no one tried to chisel off a souvenir. The 1915 World's Fair was a marvel of the new America. It featured the Tower of Jewels, covered in 100,000 cut-glass Novarium jewels that sparkled in the California sun. It had the first transcontinental telephone line, Chapter 6. It had flight demonstrations by daring pilots who were remarkably lucky not to be in Europe. But at the heart of it all sat the Liberty Bell. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming electric future of the fair. It was a reminder that while we were building towers of jewels and talking across continents, we were still carrying around the baggage of the past. The bell was the anchor. It was the thing that said, "Go ahead and invent your Pyrex and your airplanes, but don't forget where you put your foundation." The invisible assassin of war. Of course, the Twain irony of the 1915 tour was the timing. While the bell was being paraded as a symbol of proclaiming liberty throughout all the land, the United States was deeply divided over whether that liberty was worth fighting for in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had just saved the Rocky Mountains, Chapter 12, and had recently enjoyed a screening of a film glorifying the Klan, Chapter 11, used the Bell's tour as a subtle piece of peace propaganda. The bell was a silent witness to his policy of neutrality. It was a symbol of a nation that was too proud to fight, a nation that preferred to keep its icons in glass cases rather than in the trenches. But the bell's tour also served as a recruitment tool for the preparedness movement. Seeing the bell reminded people of the revolution, of the cost of sovereignty, and of the fact that sometimes, if you want to keep your bell, you have to be willing to defend the tower it hangs in. It was a Rorschach test in bronze. Some saw a reason to stay home. Others saw a reason to go to war. The final return. After 6 months in San Francisco, the bell began its long journey back to Philadelphia in November 1915. It had traveled over 10,000 miles, been kissed by thousands of strangers, and had survived the Rockies, the Sierras, and the Kansas Plains without its crack widening by a single millimeter. When it finally arrived back at Independence Hall, the city of Philadelphia gave it a hero's welcome. But the experts had seen enough. The invisible assassin of travel had taken its toll. They realized that the metal was too tired, the fractures too deep, and the risks too great. They declared that the Liberty Bell would never travel again. It was the final tour of a Victorian superstar. The bell was retired to its glass case, where it remains to this day, a silent, broken, magnificent relic of a year when we were still trying to figure out if our symbols were enough to save us from ourselves. The verdict of the bronze. The 1915 tour of the Liberty Bell was the last great object pilgrimage of the pre-digital age. It was a time when a physical thing, a heavy, silent, cracked thing, could unify a continent. Today, we share symbols with a click and a swipe, and they vanish just as quickly. But in 1915, people waited in the rain for 6 hours just to see a train car pass by. It reminds us that we are a species that needs touchstones. We need things we can kiss, things we can guard, and things we can worry about. We need to know that even if the world is changing at the speed of an airplane or a telephone call, some things are still made of heavy metal and have been broken for a very long time. As you fall asleep, imagine that train hissing through the dark Wyoming night, the electric lights illuminating a silent bell that holds the history of a nation in its cracks. 1915 was the year we took our past to see our future, and then we brought it home and locked it up for safety. Because by the end of 1915, we were starting to realize that the world was becoming a place where even a 2,000-pound bell wasn't safe from the noise. Section 5, Global Shudders. Chapter 16, The Great 1915 Hurricane, the heavyweight champion of destruction. By August 1915, the human race had become remarkably full of itself. We had spent the first half of the year proving that we could bend space-time with our minds, talk across continents with copper wires, and roll across the landscape in motorized iron kettles. We were convinced that we were finally the masters of our domain, a species so advanced that our primary pastime was figuring out increasingly expensive and complicated ways to set each other on fire. We were the stars of our own epic drama, and we assumed the rest of the planet was simply the stage, a static backdrop to our grand, tragic, and occasionally absurd ambitions. But nature, it turns out, has a very low tolerance for human hubris. While we were busy with our Great War and our industrial breakthroughs, the Atlantic Ocean was quietly brewing a reminder that compared to a well-organized tropical cyclone, a 105-horsepower tank is about as intimidating as a damp biscuit. In August and September of 1915, the Gulf Coast was treated to a double feature of atmospheric violence that proved the invisible assassin isn't always a German U-boat or a cloud of chlorine. Sometimes it's just a very large, very angry pile of humid air. The Galveston ego trip. To understand the 1915 hurricane, you first have to understand Galveston, Texas. In 1900, Galveston had been hit by a hurricane so catastrophic that it remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. It was a tragedy of such biblical proportions that the survivors decided they never wanted to play "Which Way is the Beach" with the Atlantic ever again. So they did what 20th century humans do. They threw a massive amount of concrete at the problem. They built a seawall, a 17-foot-high, 6-mile-long fortification of solid granite and concrete, designed to tell the Gulf of Mexico, "You shall go this far and no further, and please leave your shoes at the door." They even raised the entire city by pumping sand underneath it, effectively lifting thousands of buildings up by their bootstraps. By 1915, Galveston felt safe. They had the latest in Victorian engineering. They had a wall. They had the invisible assassin of the sea on a leash, or so they thought. The Category 4 Reality Check. On August 16, 1915, a storm that had been wandering through the Caribbean like a belligerent drunk finally stumbled into the Gulf. It was a Category 4 monster, with a central pressure so low it was effectively trying to suck the hats right off the people in Houston. The winds were clocked at over 120 miles per hour, which is the point at which weather ceases to be a topic of conversation and becomes a physical assault. As the storm bore down on Galveston, the city's brand-new seawall was put to the ultimate test. Imagine a 6-mile-long concrete jaw sticking out into a fistfight with the Atlantic. The storm surge, a wall of water pushed by the wind, hit the seawall with the force of 1,000 freight trains. The physics of the surge. Water weighs about 62 pounds per cubic foot. When you move several billion cubic feet of it at 50 miles per hour and slam it into a fixed object, the invisible assassin isn't being subtle. It is the kinetic equivalent of throwing a mountain at a fence. The seawall held. It was a triumph of engineering that saved thousands of lives. But nature is nothing if not creative. Since it couldn't go through the wall, it simply went over it. The Gulf of Mexico decided to take a scenic tour of the city, flooding the streets with several feet of water and depositing a massive steamship right on top of the seawall itself, like a toddler leaving a toy on a shelf. The storm didn't just break windows, it broke the landscape. It destroyed the bridge to the mainland, leaving Galveston an island once more, a wet, shivering monument to the fact that even a 17-foot wall is just a suggestion box to a Category 4 hurricane. New Orleans and the Big Wedding. A month later, while the Texans were still drying out their carpets, a second hurricane decided to pay a visit to New Orleans. New Orleans is a city built in a bowl, a geographic decision that suggests the Founding Fathers were either extreme optimists or were distracted by a particularly good plate of crawfish. In 1915, the city's drainage system was the envy of the world, a collection of massive pumps designed to suck the water out of the bowl and spit it into Lake Pontchartrain. It was a marvel of the mechanical age, proof that humans could live below sea level and still keep their socks dry. The September hurricane laughed at the pumps. It brought a storm surge that pushed the lake back into the city and dropped a staggering amount of rain in a very short period. The wind reached 126 miles per hour, tearing the roof off the St. Louis Cathedral and turning the French Quarter into an aquatic obstacle course. The New Orleans hurricane of 1915 proved that the invisible assassin doesn't need to be invisible to be effective. It just needs to be relentless. While the men in Europe were worried about a few inches of mud in a trench, the people of New Orleans were watching their entire world become an extension of the Gulf. The heavyweight champion. The 1915 storms killed hundreds and caused millions of dollars in damage. But the real tragedy, the true Twain irony, was that in the grand scheme of 1915, these events were barely a footnote. We were so obsessed with our great war, a war of our own making, a war of gear ratios and chemical formulas, that we treated a Category 4 hurricane like a minor local inconvenience. The newspapers would run a headline about the Galveston disaster on page 1, but by page 2, they were back to discussing the heroic struggle for a few hundred yards of dirt in France. It was as if we were so proud of our ability to destroy ourselves that we were offended when nature tried to do it for us. We were the masters of the universe, after all. We had Einstein. We had the telephone. We had Pyrex. How dare the wind knock over our towers? The wind's resume. A hurricane releases energy at a rate equivalent to about 200 times the world's total electrical generating capacity. Compared to that, a 1915 artillery barrage is like popping a paper bag at a rock concert. The human response. After the storm, the people of Galveston didn't say, "Maybe we shouldn't live here." They said, "We need a bigger wall." It is the quintessential human response to nature's no. A loud, expensive, and concrete yes. The verdict of the storm. The great 1915 hurricane reminded us of the scale of the abyss. It showed us that while we were busy inventing the space-time shuffle and the Iron Beast, the planet was still operating on its own ancient, terrifying clock. A hurricane doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't care about neutrality or gentlemanly war. It doesn't recognize the Liberty Bell or the Fokker interrupter gear. It is a mindless, swirling expression of physics that reminds us we are guests on this planet, not the landlords. As you fall asleep, listen to the wind outside your window. In 1915, that wind was a weapon of mass destruction. It was the invisible assassin before it decided to become visible. It reminds us that for all our tanks and our telephones, we are still just marbles rolling around on a very large, very damp trampoline. And every once in a while, the trampoline decides to give us a good shake just to see if we're still paying attention. By the end of 1915, the Gulf Coast was rebuilding. The seawall was being extended. The pumps were being upgraded. We were doubling down on our bet that we could beat the weather. We went back to our Great War, back to our blockbusters, and back to our chemical labs. But the Atlantic was still there, quietly greasing its own gears, waiting for the next time we forgot who the real heavyweight champion was. Chapter 17, Kiwanis International, the Professional Luncher's Manifesto. By January 1915, the progress of man had reached a point where we had successfully automated everything from mass-produced automobiles to mass-produced casualties. But while the invisible assassin of war was busy reshaping the borders of Europe, a much more subtle, much more polite force was gathering in a smoky room in Detroit, Michigan. This force didn't use chlorine gas or U-boats. It used business cards, firm handshakes, and a staggering amount of potato salad. This was the birth of Kiwanis International. To understand Kiwanis, you have to understand the American businessman of the early 20th century. He was a creature of starch and certainty. He wore high-collared shirts that restricted his oxygen intake, which might explain some of his financial decisions. And he possessed a bone-deep, almost spiritual need to belong to a group that had a secret password and a designated seat for him on Tuesday afternoons. In a year where the world was falling apart, the American middle class responded in the most American way possible. They decided to form a committee and have lunch. The Supreme Lodge of the Bobs. The story begins with Allen S. Brown, a professional organizer who made a living by going from city to city and convincing men that their lives were incomplete without a fancy lapel pin and a weekly meeting. Brown was a fraternal architect, a man who could build a social hierarchy out of thin air and a few membership dues. In Detroit, Brown met Joseph G. Prance, a merchant tailor who likely appreciated a good organization almost as much as he appreciated a well-sewn hymn. Originally, they didn't set out to build the world or save children, they set out to network. Their first draft of the organization was called the Supreme Lodge Benevolent Order of Brothers. Take a moment to savor that title, the Bobs. It sounds like a group of men who have reached a very specific level of domestic tranquility and have decided that their primary duty is to stand near a grill and discuss the weather. But even in 1915, the Bobs was considered a bit too casual. They needed something with more gravitas. They needed something that sounded ancient, mystical, and, most importantly, profitable. The linguistic theft, nunc qui vadis. Since the American businessman of 1915 had already exhausted the Greek and Roman classics for his fraternity names, he turned his gaze toward the people whose land he was currently sitting on. They looked at the language of the Ojibwe, Chippewa tribe, and found the phrase nunc qui vadis. Depending on which historian you ask, and how much they've had to drink, this phrase translates to either we trade, we build, or, my personal favorite, we make a noise. The founders chose we build, which was a bold claim for a group of men who spent most of their meetings deciding who was going to pay for the rolls. But Kiwanis had a ring to it. It sounded sturdy. It sounded like something that would look excellent embossed on a leather-bound ledger. And so, on January 21st, 1915, the first Kiwanis Club was officially chartered in the Motor City. The invisible assassin of corporate boredom had been defeated. The businessmen of Detroit now had a reason to leave the office, avoid their wives for 2 hours, and discuss topical authority while eating rubber chicken. The physics of the civic lunch. A civic club is a closed system where the energy of the members is directly proportional to the quality of the dessert. If the apple pie is warm, the members will vote to build a playground. If the pie is cold, they will merely vote to form a subcommittee to investigate the possibility of a playground. From profit to philanthropy. Originally, Kiwanis was a networking club. It was a place where a tailor could talk to a lawyer, who could talk to a banker, who could talk to a man who sold insurance for people who were worried about their bankers. It was a closed loop of mutual benefit, a way to make sure that the right people were getting the right contracts. But then, something strange happened. Perhaps it was the space-time shuffle of 1915, or perhaps it was just the realization that being a Bob wasn't enough to justify their existence in a world on fire. The members started to feel a twitch of civic conscience. They realized that if they were going to call themselves builders, they should probably build something other than their own bank accounts. They transitioned from a business network to a service club. This was a revolutionary shift in the American psyche. It was the moment the businessman decided to stop being a predator and start being a patron. They began to focus on good works, which in 1915 meant helping underprivileged children and improving local parks. It was a brilliant move. It gave the members a sense of moral superiority to go along with their financial success. It proved that you could be a knight of industry and a good Samaritan at the same time, provided you had enough time between the main course and the coffee. The uniform of the civic warrior. While the Anzacs, Chapter 4, were wearing slouch hats and the Germans were wearing spiked helmets, the Kiwanian wore the power suit of 1915. The collar, a stiff, detachable piece of celluloid that functioned as a low-level neck brace. It ensured that a businessman never looked down, which is a helpful posture when you're ignoring the plight of the working class. The watch fob, a heavy gold chain that suggested the wearer was a man of punctuality, even if he spent 45 minutes discussing the proper way to carve a ham. The pin, a small enameled circle on the lapel. It was the secret handshake of the middle class. If you saw another man with the pin, you knew he was a builder. You knew he was safe. You knew he probably had a really good recipe for potato salad. The verdict of the meeting. The birth of Kiwanis in 1915 was a sign that the 20th century was becoming an organized age. We were no longer a nation of rugged individuals wandering the frontier. We were a nation of joiners. We were building structures, not just of steel and glass, but of social obligation and civic duty. Kiwanis reminded us that even in the middle of a global demolition derby, there is a fundamental human urge to gather together, eat lunch, and try to fix something. While Einstein was reshaping the stars and the U-boats were reshaping the Atlantic, the Kiwanians were busy reshaping the local library. It was a quiet, modest, and remarkably persistent form of heroism. It was the heroism of the subcommittee. It was the bravery of the annual fundraiser. It was the invisible assassin of social apathy, being pecked to death by 1,000 small acts of kindness. As you fall asleep, imagine a room full of men in Detroit, 1915. They are laughing, they are smoking cigars, and they are planning a charity auction for a local orphanage. They are making a noise. And in a year that was defined by the sound of artillery and gas cylinders, the sound of a bunch of bobs trying to do some good was perhaps the most revolutionary noise of all. Chapter 18. The Women's Peace Party, the most dangerous ladies in America. By January 1915, the progress of man had reached a point where the only thing being manufactured more efficiently than artillery shells was the specialized brand of male hubris required to fire them. The world was currently being managed by a collection of very serious men with very stiff collars, men who believed that the highest expression of national dignity was to see who could stack the most corpses in a Belgian ditch. To these masters of the universe, logic was a gear ratio, and strategy was a map covered in spilled port wine. In this climate of industrialized insanity, suggesting that everyone should simply stop shooting and go home was considered more than just idealistic. It was considered a form of psychological deviance. If you were a man and you suggested peace, you were a coward. If you were a woman and you suggested it, you were a sentimentalist, a dreamer, or, most terrifyingly, a dangerous radical. On January 10, 1915, at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., 3,000 of these dangerous radicals gathered to form the Women's Peace Party. They didn't bring bayonets or chlorine gas. They brought resolutions, platforms, and the radical bridge-burning idea that perhaps the people who do the most living shouldn't be governed by the people who do the most killing. The architect of sanity, Jane Addams. The leader of this merry band of subversives was Jane Addams. Now, if you looked at Jane Addams in 1915, you wouldn't see a revolutionary. You would see a woman who looked like she might gently scold you for not finishing your vegetables. She was the founder of Hull House in Chicago, a woman who had spent her life dealing with the gritty, unwashed reality of poverty, immigration, and sanitation. She was a woman who knew that the invisible assassin wasn't just a torpedo. It was a lack of clean water and a 10-hour workday in a sweatshop. Jane Addams was a pragmatist. She didn't want peace because she was soft. She wanted peace because she was efficient. She understood that war was the ultimate waste of resources, a giant, expensive, smoke-belching machine that took perfectly good iron, wool, and young men and turned them into rust, rags, and fertilizer. To a woman who spent her days trying to balance the social ledger of a Chicago tenement, the Great War was simply a monumental failure of accounting. Joining her was Carrie Chapman Catt, a woman who possessed the organizational skills of a Roman general and the patience of a glacier. Catt was a suffragist who realized that asking for the vote was intimately tied to asking for peace. Her logic was terrifyingly simple. If women were the ones who had to give birth to the soldiers, perhaps they should have a say in whether those soldiers were sent to be used as human sandbags for a dispute over a Serbian border. The dangerous platform. The Women's Peace Party released a platform that was, by the standards of 1915, the political equivalent of a hand grenade. They called for a permanent international tribunal, a world court for people who preferred talking to stabbing, the limitation of armaments, suggesting that if you don't build the iron kettles, you're less likely to try and cook your neighbors in them, the removal of the economic causes of war, and, of course, the right of women to vote, based on the wild assumption that half the human race might have something useful to contribute to the survival of the species. The press reacted with the kind of collective fainting spell usually reserved for a Victorian maiden spotting a mouse. They called the women hysterical. They called their ideas mollycoddle philosophy. The invisible assassin of the patriarchy was out in full force, arguing that women didn't understand the harsh realities of the world, the physics of the pat on the head. In 1915, a man's argument was considered robust, even if it resulted in the destruction of a continent. A woman's argument was considered sentimental, even if it was the only thing preventing that destruction. It is a peculiar law of social gravity that the heavier the disaster, the more we ignore the people trying to stop it. The Grand Hotel and the Peace Ship. The Willard Hotel was filled with the sound of 3,000 women discussing the future of civilization. It was a sight that must have sent cold shivers down the spines of the politicians in the White House only a few blocks away. For the first time in American history, women weren't just asking for a specific charity or a local temperance law. They were demanding a seat at the table of global power. They realized that war is the ultimate gentleman's club. It's an exclusive, high-stakes game played by men who don't have to clean up the mess. The Women's Peace Party was the first unauthorized interloper in that club. They were the people who showed up to the poker game and pointed out that the cards were marked and the house was on fire. Later that year, things took an even more absurd turn when some of these women joined the Henry Ford Peace Ship. Ford, a man who was a genius at building cars and a total amateur at everything else, decided to charter a ship, the Oscar II, to sail to Europe and get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. It was a spectacular, well-intentioned, and utterly doomed circus. The press mocked them relentlessly. They called it the Ship of Fools. But there is a twain irony here. The fools on the ship were trying to stop a war that would eventually kill 20 million people. The wise men in the governments were the ones making sure those 20 million died on schedule. In the 20th century, sanity was often just a word we used to describe the most organized form of madness. The verdict of the dangerous ladies. Jane Addams was eventually labeled the most dangerous woman in America by the FBI, then the Bureau of Investigation. Think about that for a moment. In a year where people were inventing mustard gas and building Little Willie tanks, the most dangerous person in the country was a middle-aged lady from Chicago who thought we should talk about our problems instead of shooting them. The Women's Peace Party didn't stop the war. They couldn't stop the invisible assassin of national pride or the industrial momentum of the arms race. But they did something more permanent. They planted a flag. They proved that peace wasn't just a lack of war, it was a political choice. They showed that the Knight of the Air and the General on the Hill were only half the story. As you fall asleep, consider the courage of those 3,000 women in 1915. They were told they were lunatics because they wanted the world to be a place where their children could grow up instead of blowing up. They were told they didn't understand the way things work. But as history has a way of showing us, the people who say this is just the way things are usually the ones profiting from the wreckage. Jane Addams and her dangerous friends were the ones who saw the world as it could be, a place where the only thing being manufactured was a future worth living in. And while they were treated like lunatics in 1915, Jane Addams would eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. It turns out that if you wait long enough, even the fools can be proven right. Chapter 19. The Armenian Tragedy. The Great Erasure. While the rest of the world was busy with the civilized business of blowing each other up in the trenches of France or drowning in the Atlantic, the Ottoman Empire decided that 1915 was the perfect year for a little internal renovation. You see, if you're a declining superpower, the sick man of Europe, as the diplomats like to call it, and you find yourself in the middle of a global demolition derby, you have a unique opportunity. The great powers are far too preoccupied with their own survival to notice if you decide to tidy up your own backyard by removing a few million people you've decided don't fit the new decor. The invisible assassin of 1915 wasn't just a torpedo or a gas cylinder. It was a bureaucrat with a pen. It turns out that you don't need a fancy new tank or a Fokker interrupter gear to commit a massacre. You just need a very thick stack of relocation orders and a world that is looking the other way. The sick man and his new management. By 1915, the Ottoman Empire was under the management of a trio known as the Young Turks. They were essentially a political boy band that had gone horribly, lethally off the rails. Enver, Talat, and Jamal Pasha were the lead singers, and their new hit single was Pan-Turkism. They wanted a pure, unified empire, and they had decided that the Armenians, an ancient, industrious, and Christian minority, were the background noise that needed to be silenced. The Armenians had the misfortune of being successful, literate, and located right on the border where the Ottomans were fighting the Russians. In the eyes of the Young Turks, this made them a fifth column, a collection of spies and traitors waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a classic piece of political projection. When your own military campaign is failing, mostly because you sent your army into the mountains in winter without coats, it's always easier to blame the neighbors than to admit you're an incompetent general. The Travel Agency from Hell. On April 24, 1915, a date that remains a scar on the calendar, the renovation began in earnest. The Ottoman government rounded up the Armenian intellectual elite in Constantinople. Poets, doctors, lawyers, and politicians were gathered together and disappeared. It was the ultimate cancel culture, long before anyone had an internet connection. But that was just the opening act. Next came the Tachir Law, or the Relocation Law. Now, relocation is one of those lovely bureaucratic words that politicians use when mass murder sounds a bit too harsh for the morning papers. It's like saying a hurricane is a significant breeze, or that being launched into the sun is a vertical vacation. The plan was simple. The Armenians were to be moved from their homes in eastern Anatolia to the Syrian desert for their own safety. It was a travel agency run by the invisible assassin. There were no trains, no luggage, and certainly no return tickets. The physics of the forced march. If you take 100,000 people, remove the men of fighting age, and tell the rest to walk across a desert without food or water, the invisible assassin of biology does the work for you. You don't need to waste bullets when you have the sun, the sand, and the utter indifference of the government. The desert of indifference. The marches were a master class in organized cruelty. The deportees were stripped of their possessions and driven into the Syrian desert toward a place called Deir ez-Zor. Along the way, they were subjected to special organizations, essentially state-sponsored bandits, who were told that the relocated citizens were fair game. The world did notice, in a way. The American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Sr., sent a constant stream of telegrams back to Washington. He described it as a campaign of race extermination. He pleaded for intervention. But America was still in its too proud to fight phase, Chapter 15, and the British and French were busy trying to climb the cliffs of Gallipoli, Chapter 3. The Allied powers issued a joint declaration in May 1915, warning the Ottomans that they would be held responsible for crimes against humanity. It was the first time that specific phrase was used in an international document. It sounded very stern. It sounded very principled. It was also about as effective as trying to stop a forest fire by writing a polite letter to the trees. The invisible assassin of paperwork. The true horror of the Armenian tragedy was its legality. The Young Turks didn't just go on a rampage. They passed laws. They kept records. They issued receipts for the property they confiscated. They proved that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a machine gun, but a government that has decided a certain group of people no longer exists. It was a systematic erasure. Churches were turned into mosques or stables. Libraries were burned, and ancient towns were renamed. They weren't just killing people. They were trying to kill the memory of the people. It was a 20th century innovation, the total war applied to culture. The Twain irony here is that the Ottoman Empire thought this would save them. They thought that by cleaning their house, they would become strong again. Instead, they just became a graveyard. Within 3 years, the empire would be gone, carved up by the very great powers, who had been too busy to help the Armenians in 1915. The Ottoman strategy: if I can't beat the Russians, I can at least beat the civilians in my own kitchen. The global response: a collective "how terrible." Anyway, did you hear about the new tank the British are building? The silence of the map. The Armenian tragedy of 1915 is the invisible chapter of the Great War. It's the event that set the template for the rest of the century. It proved that if the world is distracted enough, you can get away with almost anything. It was the pilot episode for every other genocide that would follow in the 1900s. A young man named Raphael Lemkin would later hear about these events and realize that the world didn't even have a word for what had happened. There was no name for the systematic destruction of a people. So he invented one: genocide. But in 1915, it was just relocation. It was just internal affairs. It was just another shudder in an empire that was falling apart. As you fall asleep, consider the silence of the Syrian desert in 1915. It's a silence that was bought with paperwork and paid for with 1,000,000 lives. It reminds us that the invisible assassin doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes he hides in plain sight behind a desk, with a pen in his hand and a law on his side. We are a species that can invent the space-time shuffle and Pyrex. Yet we are also the species that can stand by and watch a neighbor be erased because we're too busy arguing about the price of wool or the shape of a trench. 1915 was the year we learned that the modern world could be just as primitive as the Stone Age, only with better record-keeping. The verdict of the void. The Armenians were the first to find out that neutrality doesn't just mean staying out of a fight. It often means staying out of the way while a crime is being committed. While the Knights of the Air were playing their synchronized jump rope with bullets, Chapter 14, and the Liberty Bell was touring the California coast, Chapter 15, a whole culture was being pushed into the void. By the end of the year, the renovation was largely complete. The Young Turks had their pure empire for a brief, blood-soaked moment. But the gears of 1916 were already greasing, and the world was about to move on to even bigger, louder, and more industrialized forms of madness. The Armenian tragedy became a whisper in the wind, a hilarious history that isn't funny at all, but rather a cynical reminder that in the global demolition derby, the small cars are always the first to be crushed. Section 6, Final Verdict. Chapter 20, 1916 is greasing its gears. The century loses its baby teeth. Well, here we are. We have reached the end of 1915, a year that began with the naive hope that everyone would be home by Christmas and ended with the grim realization that Christmas was now just a tactical pause to allow for the delivery of more ammunition. If 1914 was the year the world slipped on a banana peel, 1915 was the year the world decided to solve the problem by declaring war on the banana, the peel, and the gravity that made the fall possible. As the calendar prepares to flip its final page, we find ourselves standing in the wreckage of a century that has officially lost its baby teeth. Those sharp, jagged New World incisors are finally showing, and they are hungry. The 20th century is no longer a new era of gleaming brass and starched optimism. It is a full-grown, coal-smudging, gear-grinding beast that has developed a taste for the spectacular. The cosmic scorecard. Let us look at the scorecard before we hand the keys over to 1916. In the laboratory of the human mind, Albert Einstein has finished his masterpiece. He has taken the universe, which we previously thought was a sturdy, reliable old grandfather clock, and informed us that it is actually a sagging mattress in a cheap motel. By the end of 1915, gravity is no longer a pull between friends. It is a dent in the fabric of existence. The stars are bending their light just to get around the sun, proving that even the most distant celestial bodies have to navigate the geometry of the road. It is a brilliant, elegant truth that explains the movement of the heavens, yet it leaves us precisely where we started, stuck on a spinning rock, wondering where we put our umbrellas. We have weighed the light, but we still haven't figured out how to share a sandwich without a treaty. The industrialization of the whoops. Technologically, 1915 was the year we learned that if you build a better mousetrap, the universe will simply build a better mouse, usually one with a machine gun. We successfully talked from New York to San Francisco, Chapter 6, proving that distance is a lie, but we spent most of that time shouting, "Can you hear me now?" across 3,400 miles of copper. We discovered that railroad glass can survive a Sunday roast in the form of Pyrex, Chapter 8, finally allowing us to watch our casseroles fail in high definition. We even invented the Fokker interrupter gear, Chapter 14, a piece of engineering so precise it allowed us to shoot through a spinning propeller without hitting the blades, a technological leap that ensured the knights of the air could murder each other with professional efficiency instead of just throwing bricks. But for every hello on the telephone, there was a Lusitania, Chapter 1, settling into the Atlantic mud. For every blockbuster movie, Chapter 9, there was a dark stain on the American soul. We proved that we could build a 17-foot seawall in Galveston, Chapter 16, only to have the ocean politely step over it and deposit a steamship on our front lawn. It was a year of the high-stakes irony, where our greatest achievements were almost always used to facilitate our most spectacular disasters. The Western Front, the world's most expensive graveyard. As 1915 draws to a close, the Western Front has become a permanent fixture of the landscape. It is a 400-mile-long wound that refuses to heal. The Gentleman's War is a distant memory buried under a layer of chlorine gas, Chapter 2, and the tracks of Little Willie, Chapter 13. We have entered the era of the Mechanics' War. Courage is no longer a matter of a shiny sword and a well-groomed horse. It is a matter of staying dry in a hole for 6 months and hoping the guy 3 miles away isn't a better mathematician than you. The invisible assassin of artillery has turned the earth into a moonscape, and the only thing growing in the fields of France is the list of people who will never see 1916. The generals are still sitting in their chateaus, staring at maps and wondering why their grand breakthroughs keep getting stuck in the mud. They haven't realized that the machine gun has made the map obsolete. In 1915, you didn't gain territory. You just traded 1,000 lives for a few yards of dirt that smelled like a chemical spill. The shadow and the light. We cannot leave 1915 without acknowledging the duality of the human spirit. We saw the Women's Peace Party, Chapter 18, standing in Washington, suggesting with dangerous sanity that perhaps we should stop killing each other. They were treated like lunatics for wanting a future, while the men in hoods on Stone Mountain, chapter 11, were treated like heroes for wanting a past that never existed. We saw the Armenian tragedy, chapter 19, a systematic erasure that proved the modern world could be just as primitive as the Stone Age, provided you have enough stamps and relocation orders. It was a reminder that when the great powers fight, the small people are the first to be ground into the gears. But we also saw the Liberty Bell, chapter 15, tour the country, a cracked symbol of a nation still trying to decide if it was too proud to fight or just waiting for the right check. And we saw Rocky Mountain National Park, chapter 12, set aside, a rare moment of preservation in a year of total destruction. We decided that even if we were going to ruin the rest of the world, we should probably keep at least one mountain range in its original packaging. 1916, greasing the gears. As the sun sets on 1915, the global demolition derby is just getting its second wind. 1916 is already waiting in the wings, and it isn't bringing a peace treaty. It's bringing Verdun. It's bringing the Somme. It's bringing the realization that total war doesn't just mean everyone is fighting. It means everyone is losing. The gears of the new year are being greased with oil, blood, and the frantic ink of 1,000 bureaucracies. The 20th century has realized that it doesn't need to be civilized to be advanced. It has discovered that you can have a telephone in your hand and a bayonet in your neighbor's ribs. And as long as the copper wires stay intact, we call it progress. Einstein has bent the stars, but we are still the same confused bipeds who can't find our keys. We have conquered the air, but we only used it to get a better view of the slaughter. We have talking machines and seeing glass and motorized iron kettles, and yet, as we face 1916, we are more afraid of the dark than we were when we were living in caves. The final verdict. So, as you drift off to sleep, listen to the hum of the world. It's the sound of 1915 fading into history, a year that was funny, smart, witty, and profoundly, heartbreakingly stupid. It was the year we officially abandoned the gentleman's war for the scientific slaughterhouse. 1915 was the year we learned that the invisible assassin is always watching, whether it's gravity, a U-boat, or our own capacity for self-delusion. It was the year the world grew up, and it turns out that growing up mostly just means getting better at making excuses for our mistakes. Sleep well, for 1916 is greasing its gears. The space-time shuffle is just beginning, and the iron beasts are just getting their first taste of the mud. But don't worry, we still have our Pyrex. At least we can see the disaster coming through the glass. And in the 20th century, that's about as much of a miracle as any of us can expect. The end. This has been Mark Twain.